Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Shadows of Arizona. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dry, cracked earth as I sat on the porch of my small cabin, sipping water from a canteen. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds heading back to their nests and the whisper of the wind brushing through the cacti and scrub. This was home, this quiet, empty stretch of Arizona desert. It had been my home for the past 7 years, and in that time, I had become accustomed to the solitude, the rhythm of the land. I had come here to escape the noise of the world, to be alone with my thoughts. And for the most part, I had found peace. But recently, something had started to change. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, small things I could never quite put my finger on. A rustle in the bushes when the wind wasn't blowing. A fleeting movement at the edge of my vision, something I could never catch, just shadows flitting between the rocks. I brushed it off, telling myself that it was just the desert playing tricks on me. It was hot, it was dry, and sometimes the mind could play cruel games in this vast, empty expanse. I had always been alone here, and I had learned to embrace the silence. My cabin was far enough from the nearest town that the only company I had were the occasional hikers passing through or the distant howl of coyotes under the cover of night. But as I sat there, staring out into the fading light, I felt something creeping just beneath the surface of my calm. A sensation of being watched. It wasn't like anything I could explain. Not the cold shiver of fear that comes from hearing a noise at night. No, this was different. It was more like a presence, a quiet pressure that pressed in from all sides, making the air feel heavier than it should. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the thought from my mind. It was probably nothing. Just the isolation, I told myself. 7 years in the desert had a way of bending a man's perception of reality. Maybe I was just imagining things, like I had with so many other strange occurrences before. But then it happened again. A flicker of movement. A shadow, maybe. Too fast to be a bird or a passing cloud. I blinked, trying to focus, but there was nothing there. The desert stretched out in every direction, empty and vast, a sea of nothingness beneath the setting sun. I stood up from my chair and walked to the edge of the porch, scanning the landscape for any sign of life. But all I saw was the same dry, cracked earth and the occasional scrub of cactus. No animals, no people. Nothing. For a moment, I felt a sense of calm return, as though the desert had just settled back into its regular rhythm. But then, as I turned back to go inside, I felt it again, the faintest sensation that something was waiting. Something in the shadows, just beyond my reach. I shook my head, forcing the thought away. It was just the heat. I hadn't been sleeping well lately. Maybe I needed to rest, get some sleep, and everything would feel normal again. But deep down, a small voice nagged at me, telling me that something was wrong. Something was out there, just beyond the horizon. I locked the door behind me and settled in for the night, trying to push the feeling from my mind. But as the darkness settled over the desert, I couldn't shake the sense that the shadows were closing in around me. The next few days passed in a blur of heat and silence, just the way I liked it. But with each passing hour, the feeling of unease seemed to grow, creeping into my thoughts when I wasn't looking. It wasn't anything I could put into words, nothing that could be seen clearly, but it was there. It began with the shadows. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shift in the light, maybe a trick of the fading sun. I'd glance over, expecting to see a coyote or some small creature darting into the brush, but there was never anything. The first few times, I thought it was just the heat playing tricks on me. After all, in the desert, the air shifts and the light bends in strange ways, creating illusions, distorting the landscape. The desert had its own rhythm, and I was used to its subtle, maddening tricks. But then the shadows began to move more deliberately. I would be standing in the yard, stretching out my stiff limbs after a long day of work, and out of the corner of my eye, I would catch something, just a quick flicker, a shape shifting in the distance. My gaze would snap over to it, and for a split second, I'd swear I saw something, some figure, some dark shape that wasn't supposed to be there. But when I looked directly, nothing. Just the sprawling desert and the cracked earth beneath my feet. It was the kind of thing that could drive a man mad if he let it. Each time I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the way the light played off the sand, or the wind stirring the desert plants in ways I hadn't noticed before. But the shadows came more often, and they seemed to be moving closer. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk further into the desert, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The landscape was the same as always, wide stretches of nothingness, broken only by the occasional twisted mesquite tree or distant mountain. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows were with me again, shifting just at the edge of my vision, always there, but always just out of reach. I quickened my pace, trying to dismiss the thought. This was the desert. It played tricks on people. I had been here long enough to know that. Exhaustion had a way of warping the mind, especially after days of hard labor under the burning sun. The heat could make you see things that weren't real. But it didn't explain the growing sense of unease, that crawling sensation on the back of my neck that never seemed to leave. By the time I made my way back to the cabin, the sun had already begun to dip below the horizon. The desert was cooling, and the shadows grew longer. I glanced out toward the empty expanse one last time, feeling the familiar chill creep over me. For just a moment, as the last light of day flickered out, I could have sworn I saw something. I blinked hard, forcing my eyes to focus. Nothing. Just the desert. I took a deep breath, muttered a curse under my breath, and went inside. I would sleep it off, I told myself. It was probably nothing more than the desert's strange atmosphere. The heat. The isolation. I locked the door behind me and settled into bed, trying to push the creeping fear out of my mind. But as the wind began to howl outside, carrying with it the distant cries of coyotes, I couldn't help but feel that something was still out there, just beyond the reach of the fading light. The days seemed to blur together. I went about my usual chores, fixing up the old fence, mending the roof, making sure the water supply was still holding up. The work was hard, but it was familiar, soothing, almost. The desert had a way of keeping a man grounded. The quietness of the landscape, the rhythm of labor, it all helped me keep the creeping unease at bay. But still, it lingered, a quiet nagging at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. The shadows seemed to be everywhere now. Not in the obvious way, not in the direct line of sight, but just outside the edges of my perception. A flicker here, a shift in the light there. I would turn to look, expecting to see something, a bird, a rabbit, a wandering coyote, but there was never anything. The desert was vast, and in its emptiness, I started to feel like it was closing in on me, like the land itself was watching, waiting. The sun set earlier each evening, and the dark brought with it a new kind of silence, thick and suffocating. The wind died down, and all that remained was the quiet hiss of the sand as it shifted in the night air. I found myself staying inside more and more, the evening routine becoming more of a ritual than a necessity. As soon as the light faded, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and made sure nothing could get in. It felt like a habit I had formed, even though nothing had ever threatened me before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last traces of daylight flickered out, I heard something. At first, it was faint, a light rustling, almost like the wind picking up again. But no breeze was blowing. I waited, straining to hear, hoping it would stop. But then, I heard it again. The distinct sound of footsteps crunching through the sand, slow and deliberate. I froze. The noise was coming from outside, not far from the cabin. My pulse quickened. I stood up from my chair, slowly, moving to the window. My heart was beating too loud in my chest. I tried to steady my breath, to convince myself it was just an animal. A wild dog, maybe. Coyotes roamed the area from time to time, and they were known to come close when they were hungry. But the sound was too measured, too steady, too deliberate. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside, scanning the yard. The desert lay there, bathed in the eerie light of the half-moon, still and undisturbed. No movement. Nothing. Just the vast emptiness, stretching out to the distant hills. I waited a moment, my eyes flicking back and forth, trying to catch even the slightest sign of life. Nothing. I exhaled slowly and let the curtain fall back into place. Maybe it had been the wind after all. A trick of the night. The desert was full of strange noises, echoes, shifting sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, just like the shadows. The desert was too quiet, too empty. It had a way of making a person's senses sharper, more on edge. I turned away from the window, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But as I did, I heard it again. A soft crunching of footsteps in the sand, this time closer. My blood ran cold. I stepped back toward the window, my hands trembling slightly. I forced myself to look out once more, but this time I didn't move the curtain. Instead, I held my breath, listening, trying to pinpoint the sound. There was nothing. Not a rustle of sand. Not a breeze. Just the quiet hum of the night, stretching out into the desert like it always did. But the feeling lingered. The feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for me to look away. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of discomfort that clung to me even before I opened my eyes. It wasn't the kind of thing I could point to, just an unsettling feeling that had settled into my bones. I had been up most of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, I forced myself to get up, to do something, to push the nagging thoughts away. The desert was wide, open, and empty. It always had been. There was nothing out here that could hurt me. But as I stepped out of the cabin, something caught my eye. I froze on the porch, staring down at the ground. The sand around my cabin wasn't smooth and undisturbed as it should have been. There were deep, almost claw-like marks in the dirt, dragging in long arcs. They were unmistakable, wide, gouging lines that looked like something had dragged its weight across the ground. I knelt down, running a hand through the sand, and could feel the impression left behind, too deep, too deliberate to be made by an animal, I thought. The marks continued in several directions, leading toward the porch, curving around the cabin, and then fading into the distance toward the desert's edge. I stood back up, scanning the area. There was no sign of what had made the marks, no tracks, no footprints, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation. It was as if whatever had made them had simply appeared from thin air. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of animal, something large, maybe a mountain lion, or even a bear. It was rare, but not impossible. The desert had its share of creatures that I rarely saw. But there was something about the marks that made my skin crawl. They weren't like any animal tracks I had seen before. They were too clean, too intentional. I couldn't explain why, but the pattern of the marks felt like it was leading me somewhere, towards something I didn't want to understand. I stepped back toward the porch, my eyes still scanning the ground, when I saw something else. A mark on the door. At first, I thought it was just dirt or the usual wear from the harsh desert environment, but when I leaned closer, my blood ran cold. The door had deep, vertical scratches, as if something had raked its claws across the wood. They weren't subtle. These were heavy gouges, sharp and deliberate. I ran my fingers along the grooves, trying to steady my breath, but they didn't feel natural. There was a strange warmth to them, like they had been made only recently. My mind started to race, all the pieces coming together in fragments, shadows in my vision, the footsteps I couldn't see, and now these marks. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I felt it. Something was out there, something watching me, something that had crossed the boundary between the desert and my cabin. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. It was real. It was tangible. I could feel it. I stepped back, looking at the marks again, feeling the tension tighten in my chest. I had no explanation. There was no animal I knew that could leave marks like this, that could make me feel this way. I thought about checking the area around the cabin, looking for more clues, but the thought of going further into the desert alone sent a chill down my spine. The air felt heavier than it had before, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I closed the door carefully, locking it behind me. I couldn't explain what I was feeling, but I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks anymore. There was something out there, and it wasn't just a shadow. It was real. And it was getting closer. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt too still, too thick, like the world had gone silent in a way that wasn't natural. I locked all the windows and doors as usual, but the unease from earlier in the day clung to me like a second skin. I could hear the distant call of coyotes, but it did nothing to soothe the gnawing anxiety that had taken root deep in my chest. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts running wild. The marks on the door, the scratches on the ground, the footsteps I had heard, they kept looping through my mind in an endless cycle. Something was out there. Something was waiting. But what was it? As if answering my unspoken question, I saw it again. I had been trying to distract myself by staring out the window, watching the moonlight cast long shadows across the desert, when I saw it, a figure at the edge of my vision. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but then it moved again, unmistakably there, just outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. This time, I saw it clearer. A shadow, no, a shape, standing in the moonlight. It was tall, much taller than a man, and it seemed to move with a fluid, unnatural grace. It was a darkness that swallowed the light around it, a blackness that seemed to bend the very air. The shadow shifted, stretching and contracting, as though it was made of something other than solid matter. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away, every muscle in my body tense with fear. It was only out of the corner of my eye, but it was real. The same figure I had glimpsed in passing, only now it was standing still, waiting. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The shadow loomed just beyond the porch, just out of reach of the light that spilled from the window, as though it didn't want to be seen clearly. I felt my legs shaking, my stomach churning with anxiety. I wanted to move, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. Something about it held me in place, a terrifying sense that if I blinked, if I looked away for even a moment, it would be gone. Or worse, it would be closer. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or maybe some animal, a twisted shape cast by the branches of a tree. But I couldn't rationalize it. No matter how hard I tried, the figure didn't make sense. There was no form to it. No depth. It was just a shadow, a dark mass that seemed to stretch and shift with no clear shape, like it was trying to avoid being caught in full view. Then it moved. It didn't step or walk, at least not like anything I knew. The shadow slid, a fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of nature. It crept along the side of the cabin, its shape flickering with each movement, like it was teasing me, staying just out of reach, just out of view. I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck, the hairs standing up on my arms. I had to look away, had to force myself to breathe, but it was impossible to pull my eyes from it. What was it? Why was it always just out of view? Every time I tried to get a better look, it would shift, move, or vanish altogether, slipping into the darkness like it had never been there. I stood there, staring, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew it was there, I could feel it, but every time I looked directly at it, it would disappear into the night, as though it were nothing more than a figment of my imagination. I stepped back from the window, my legs unsteady beneath me. I felt lightheaded, dizzy with the sudden realization that I wasn't alone. Whatever that thing was, it was real, and it wasn't just in my head. I paced the cabin, my mind racing. What did it want? Why hadn't it attacked? Why was it just watching me, staying at the edge of my vision? A part of me wanted to rush outside, to confront it head-on, to find out what was really lurking in the darkness. But another part, the smarter part, held me back. The cabin, the door, the walls, they were the only things keeping me safe from whatever it was. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, holding it in a vice-like grip, though I knew it wouldn't do much if I came face to face with whatever that shadow was. Still, I felt I needed to do something. To prepare. To act. But even as I clicked the flashlight on, the beam of light trembling in my hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread that made my every instinct scream to run. There was no escaping this. Whatever was out there was waiting for me, and it had all the time in the world. The morning light did little to chase away the dread that had settled in my bones. I woke up, still shaking, as if the terror from last night hadn't let go of me, even in sleep. The shadow was all I could think about, and my mind had twisted itself into knots trying to rationalize what I had seen, or thought I had seen. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light. That the shadows in the desert, the strange angles of the trees and rocks, had played some cruel illusion on my tired mind. It was exhaustion. The isolation. The desert was harsh on a man's mind, making him see things that weren't really there. I tried to shake the thoughts away as I sat at the small kitchen table, sipping my coffee. The desert outside seemed to stretch on forever, silent and unmoving. But the stillness felt different today. Heavier. It was almost as if the silence had weight, pressing down on me from all sides. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks, checking the water levels, repairing the fence, doing anything to keep my mind busy, but the unease lingered, following me like a shadow of its own. As I stepped outside to inspect the fence, I noticed something odd, something I hadn't expected. There was a smell in the air, faint but unmistakable. It hit me like a slap in the face. A rank, sour odor that clawed at my throat. It was like the smell of decay, of rot. The kind of stench that you associate with something long dead, left to fester in the heat. The breeze carried it to me from the direction of the desert, and I immediately felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just the carcass of some animal, something that had fallen prey to the harsh conditions out here. The desert could be unforgiving in that way. But the smell, it didn't sit right. It was thicker, almost cloying, and it seemed to get stronger the longer I stood there. It was as if the wind itself had turned foul, bringing the stench of death from the depths of the sand. I turned in the direction of the smell, my eyes scanning the desert for any sign of the source. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. No dead animal carcass, no signs of scavengers, no bones or bodies. The desert was empty, just like it always had been. I told myself it was just another oddity of the desert, just another strange smell that came with the land. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected. The shadow, the marks, the footsteps, everything was starting to come together, even though I didn't want it to. I walked back inside, trying to ignore the unsettling odor that clung to my clothes. The smell followed me, as if it had seeped into my skin, into my very being. It was a heavy, choking scent that filled my lungs and refused to leave. I opened a window, hoping that the breeze might clear the air, but it didn't help. If anything, it made the stench worse, stronger. It seemed to be everywhere now, coiling around me like a presence I couldn't escape. I sat back down at the table, wiping my hands on a cloth, but the smell lingered, clinging to my skin like something tangible, something alive. I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever it was, whatever was out there, it wasn't just in my head. I could smell it. I could feel it. And now, I was sure of one thing, it was getting closer. I looked around the cabin, my eyes darting over the familiar surroundings. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. My mind was racing again, all the little details from the past days stacking up like bricks in a wall. The footsteps, the scratches on the door, the shadow that watched from the edges of my vision. I knew something was out there. And I knew it wasn't just an animal. Whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't a trick of the mind. I could feel its presence now, stronger than ever before. It was there, waiting. And I couldn't run from it. The day dragged on with an unbearable slowness, the heavy air pressing in around me, thick with tension. Every noise felt too loud, too close, scratches from the wind, the creak of the wood as the cabin settled, even my own heartbeat seemed to echo in the stillness. The foul smell still lingered, clinging to the corners of the room as if it had soaked into the very walls. I tried to keep myself busy, doing small tasks around the cabin, anything to avoid thinking about what was happening. But every movement felt like it was being watched. Every creak of the floorboard, every turn of my head, seemed to invite something closer, something waiting just outside of my reach. I couldn't wait any longer to take action. The thought of sitting idly by, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move, filled me with a raw kind of fear that twisted in my gut. I needed to know what was happening, needed to feel like I was doing something to fight back against this creeping terror. The shadow, the strange sounds, the marks, there had to be an explanation. And if I couldn't find one, then I had to make sure that whatever was watching me couldn't get any closer. I spent the afternoon preparing, setting up traps around the perimeter of the cabin. I knew the desert animals well enough to know what worked to keep them at bay: simple snares and tripwires, camouflaged in the dust and rocks. But this time, my focus was different. I wasn't trying to catch a rabbit or a coyote. I wanted to catch the thing that had been haunting my every step, the thing that had been lurking just out of sight. I went methodically, setting each trap with care, my hands steady even though my mind was anything but. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, but I didn't stop. I worked until there was a ring of snares around the cabin, each one connected to a thin, nearly invisible wire, ready to spring at the slightest disturbance. The thought of what might be caught in them didn't ease the unease gnawing at my insides. But it was all I had. There was no other way to face the unknown that waited out there in the dark. I wanted answers. I needed to know if there was something out there, something more than just the madness of the desert. As the last light of the day bled from the sky, I retreated inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. The darkness pressed in like a living thing, and I could feel my heart starting to race. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks: dinner, checking the traps from the window, but the anxiety I'd been carrying all day twisted into something sharper, more urgent. The night stretched on, still and heavy. The desert outside seemed to hold its breath, as though everything had fallen silent in anticipation. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat by the window, peering out into the blackness, but there was nothing, no movement, no signs of life. Just the empty desert, stretching out endlessly, the occasional rustle of wind stirring the sand. I kept my eyes trained on the edge of the light spilling from the window, my body taut, ready for any sign that the traps had been triggered. But as the night deepened, something else began to shift. The shadows outside the cabin, those same shadows that I had seen before, started to grow darker. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks in the dim light, but then I realized it wasn't just darkness. The shadows were moving. At the edges of my vision, I saw them stretch and flicker, curling in unnatural angles, as if something was shifting within them. They seemed to grow, to reach out, creeping closer to the light, but never fully stepping into it. Just like before, they were always just outside the edge of my sight. Always at the periphery. I stood frozen by the window, my pulse thumping in my ears. The longer I watched, the more the feeling of being watched grew. It wasn't just in my head this time. I could feel it, a pressure against my skin, a suffocating weight that pushed down from all directions. I thought I saw movement again, this time more definite. Something was there, something taller, darker than any shadow I had seen before. It moved slowly, fluidly, as if it was dancing with the darkness itself, a thing that could bend the very space around it. The air in the cabin grew heavier, thick with a feeling I couldn't place. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to do anything to escape this feeling, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness outside. And then, I heard it. The faintest sound, a whisper, almost like a breath, carried on the wind. It was a sound that had no source, no direction. Just a fleeting sensation in the air, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The whispers seemed to echo in the silence, growing louder, closer, until they filled the space inside the cabin, curling around me like the shadow itself. I rushed to the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The feeling of being surrounded, trapped in this room with whatever was out there, was overwhelming. The shadows were closing in, filling every corner, suffocating the air with their presence. I glanced out the window again, my breath catching in my throat. The figure I had seen before was closer now, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its outline was clearer, more defined, but still made of shadow, its form indistinguishable, an amalgamation of darkness. I could see its shape stretching impossibly long, like it was reaching for me, waiting for me to step out into the night. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I backed away from the window, my body frozen in place. Whatever it was real. And it was getting closer. I woke in the middle of the night, my body stiff and my mind still haunted by the lingering shadows I had seen outside. The air in the cabin felt heavy, almost oppressive, as though it had been holding its breath while I slept. I had no idea how much time had passed, but the darkness outside seemed deeper, more absolute than before. The silence was unnerving. It wasn't the comforting silence of the desert. No, this was different. It felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My body was still tense, every muscle coiled tight with anxiety. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that I was just imagining things, but that same sense of dread gnawed at me from the inside. I grabbed my rifle from the corner of the room and crept quietly to the window, peering out into the night. The shadows were still there, flickering in the periphery of my vision, but there was nothing distinct, nothing I could point to. Yet, I could still feel them, those eyes, watching me from just beyond the edge of the light. The unease twisted inside me, but I tried to focus. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to think clearly. I wasn't some nervous city boy and used to the desert. I'd been here for years. I knew how to handle myself, how to survive. But tonight was different. There was something out there, something that didn't belong. I decided to wait. Wait until daylight. In the morning, I'd check the traps again, see if anything had triggered them. If it was an animal, then at least I'd be able to figure out what it was. But I couldn't stay awake forever, and eventually, exhaustion won over. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, but it was broken, fragmented, like my mind couldn't decide if it was awake or dreaming. I woke several times during the night, each time more disoriented, more restless. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the cracks in the cabin's walls, I was already up and moving. My thoughts were still clouded with sleep, but the heavy sense of dread was undeniable. I grabbed my rifle again and went outside to inspect the area around the cabin. The first thing I noticed were the tracks. They weren't there the night before, and they sure as hell hadn't come from any animal I knew. They were deep, as though something large had moved through the sand, but the shapes, those shapes, didn't fit any known creature. The tracks were wide and uneven, like something that didn't walk in a straight line, or perhaps something that dragged itself along the ground. I knelt down to get a better look, my fingers brushing the prints in the sand. The edges were ragged, disturbed, as though whatever had left them had moved with unnatural speed and force. The footprints didn't belong to anything I had ever seen before. They were too strange, too irregular. I looked around the area, trying to keep calm. My breath was shallow, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it be some kind of new desert predator? A rare animal I hadn't heard of before? No, this was different. The prints didn't match anything that could exist in the desert. The tracks circled the cabin, leading from one side to the other, and then stopped. Right at the door. It was as though whatever had made them had come to a halt, right where I had stood, where I had locked myself in. I stood up slowly, feeling a chill creep down my spine despite the rising sun. The tracks didn't make sense. The pattern didn't follow any natural logic. I couldn't explain it. I turned to look at the door, Nothing had changed there, no sign of tampering, no way of knowing how close I had come to whatever had left those marks. But I felt it. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that same heavy weight of being watched. A low growl rumbled through the still air, faint but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I snapped my head around, searching the desert for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The sand, the rocks, the sparse desert vegetation, everything was still. And yet, that sound lingered in my ears, curling in the back of my mind, refusing to leave. I tried to rationalize it. It was just the wind, I told myself. The desert had its noises, strange noises that could make you think you heard things. The wind through the brush, the distant calls of animals I couldn't see. It was natural. But something in my gut told me it wasn't natural. I had lived here too long to mistake the sounds of the desert. The wind didn't growl. The sand didn't echo with that same guttural tone. This was different. I inspected the tracks more closely. The prints weren't deep enough to belong to something enormous, but they were too wide and spread out to belong to anything small. They reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. A memory, a half-forgotten story from my childhood, whispered in the back of my mind. I stood up abruptly, wiping my hand on my pants, trying to shake off the creeping unease that was tightening around my chest. No, I couldn't let myself be consumed by fear. I was here to survive. I looked around again, trying to piece everything together. The shadows from last night, the smell that had followed me, the strange marks on the door, and now these tracks. Whatever was out there, whatever was playing this game with me, wasn't just some ordinary desert animal. It was something different. Something worse. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. No. I would not let it control me. I would figure this out. I would find whatever was out there, and I would face it, no matter what it was. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't facing just any predator. I was facing something far more dangerous. Something that knew how to hide in the shadows and strike when least expected. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I tried to push it down. I had work to do, things to fix, things to check. The sun had risen higher in the sky, burning away the chill of the early morning. The heat was beginning to settle in, but the discomfort in my chest, tight, like something pressing in on me, was impossible to ignore. I walked away from the tracks, back toward the cabin, trying to ground myself in the normalcy of the day. There were chores to tend to, equipment to maintain. That's what I needed to focus on. The tracks didn't make sense, but maybe they weren't meant to. Maybe it was a wild animal, a new predator, perhaps something that had adapted to the harsh desert life. My mind tried to wrap itself around that idea, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to believe that it was something as simple as that. But the feeling wouldn't let go. The air seemed heavier now. As I worked on the various tasks around the cabin, repairing the door frame, checking the well, refilling the water supply, I kept hearing it. Faint at first, like a whisper on the breeze. It didn't sound like the normal desert wind. No, this was something else. A murmur, a soft breath, barely audible, but undeniably there. I paused, my hand gripping the handle of my toolbox, listening intently. I looked around, the vast emptiness of the desert stretching in every direction. The whispers were still there, like a low, distant hum just at the edge of my hearing, teasing my senses. They came from nowhere, from all around me, as if the very desert itself had a voice. I told myself it was just the wind, playing tricks on me, like it often did. The desert had its oddities, strange shifts in the air, vibrations in the ground that could make your mind play games. And yet, even as I repeated this to myself, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my stomach. I shook my head and forced myself to ignore it. But as I moved around the back of the cabin, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in the distance. My heart skipped, and I turned quickly, expecting to see some desert animal, a coyote or a bird. But there was nothing. Just the rolling dunes and sparse brush stretching out under the hot sun. The wind picked up again, rustling the dry leaves of the sagebrush, but I couldn't focus on that. No, my attention was drawn to the shadows around me. They had started to behave differently, stretching unnaturally across the ground, bending at strange angles. There was no reason for them to be so sharp, so pronounced, especially given the sun was high in the sky. I watched, frozen, as the shadows flickered again, moving in ways that shouldn't have been possible. They curled in on themselves, twisting, growing longer and darker. My pulse quickened as I felt the temperature around me drop, the heat of the day suddenly feeling distant. The shadows seemed to be reaching, stretching toward me, toward the cabin. The whispers grew louder now, more distinct, like voices carried on the wind. Soft at first, like a murmur between friends, but then they grew clearer. I could almost make out words, though none of them made sense. I turned in place, my eyes scanning the empty desert, my chest tight with fear. The wind carried the sound, but there was no one here, no one to be speaking, no one to be whispering. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, trying to rationalize what I was feeling. My mind told me it was just the desert playing tricks on me. The wind could do strange things. The heat and isolation could distort the senses. I had lived here for years, and I knew that the desert could make a man question reality. But even as I tried to tell myself that, my instincts screamed otherwise. I stepped closer to the cabin, keeping my eyes on the moving shadows. The air felt thick with the whispers, as though they were moving around me, closing in. And as I reached for the door, the shadows behind me grew bolder. The air itself seemed to hum, alive with an unnatural energy. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as something I couldn't see, moved just behind me, barely a breath away. I spun around, but the moment I did, there was nothing. The shadows had returned to their usual places, benign and ordinary, lying flat across the desert floor. But I felt it, the presence, the weight of it pressing on me from all sides. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, like a distant chorus in the wind, beckoning, pulling me deeper into the unknown. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The desert felt less like a place of isolation and more like a trap, like the land itself was turning against me. I backed into the cabin, my hands fumbling to open the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears. The shadows were closer now, impossibly close, and I could feel their presence more than I could see them. It was as though they were right there, just beyond the threshold, waiting for me to step out. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, but the unease wouldn't leave. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to calm my breath. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in around me, as if the desert itself was slowly squeezing me, trying to force me to confront whatever was out there. The shadows didn't belong here, and neither did the whispers. This was something else. Something beyond the natural order. Something that had no place in the world I knew. And whatever it was getting closer. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the desert. The heat was fading, but the air still felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an unseen tension. My heart raced in my chest, and every muscle in my body felt tight, ready to spring into action, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the desert itself had wrapped its invisible hands around me, holding me in place. The whispers had faded with the daylight, but the sense of being watched never left. It hung in the air like a storm on the brink of breaking. I pressed my back harder against the cabin wall, my hand gripping the rifle so tightly my fingers ached. The shadows outside had grown long, and they no longer behaved like ordinary shadows. They stretched unnaturally, elongating with every passing second, as if they were reaching for something or someone. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and tried to convince myself it was just a play of light and dark. The desert had a way of distorting perception, of twisting the world in ways that made the familiar feel foreign. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the shadows. Something was moving outside. Something was hunting me. Then it came. A deep growl, low and guttural, rumbled through the air, shaking the ground beneath me. It was like no sound I had ever heard before, an unearthly noise that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The growl wasn't the call of any predator I knew. It wasn't a coyote or a mountain lion or even a snake. This was something different, something monstrous. I didn't dare move. I didn't even dare to breathe. My eyes scanned the edges of the desert, searching for any sign of movement, but everything was still. The vast, empty landscape stretched out before me, bathed in the fading light of the sunset, and yet I could feel it. I could feel that it was out there, close, so close. The shadows were moving again, this time in ways that defied reason. They twisted, contorted, stretching and pulling in strange directions, as if they were alive. At first, it was just a flicker at the corner of my vision, but then it became undeniable. They were shifting toward the cabin, creeping closer, inching their way forward like something sentient, something with purpose. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to flee, to escape the grip of the desert that had me pinned here, but my legs refused to respond. I was paralyzed by fear, locked in place by the unseen predator outside. The growl came again, louder this time, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. I could feel it vibrating through the walls, vibrating through my bones. It was a warning. A promise. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to center myself, to calm my mind. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest, drowning out everything else. The growl lingered, echoing in the distance, but it was followed by a deeper silence, one that swallowed every other sound, every breath of wind, every rustle of leaves. It was a silence that filled the space between moments, as though time itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I dared to open my eyes again. The shadows were closer now, too close. They moved with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible, sliding across the ground like smoke or ink, winding their way around the base of the cabin. I could see them, not just in my peripheral vision, but in full, sharp detail. They were no longer just shapes in the desert night, they were things. I stepped backward, my boots dragging on the wooden floor as I made my way to the farthest corner of the cabin. My hand trembled as I raised the rifle, but I couldn't bring myself to aim it. Not at the shadows. Not at whatever was lurking just beyond them. And then it happened. A shape, a figure, appeared in the shadows. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, a form so wrong, so unnatural, that my mind refused to accept it. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something in between, a grotesque distortion of both. It had long, twisted limbs, skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame, and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural, predatory intelligence. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, barely keeping my feet. The figure stood at the edge of the shadows, just outside the reach of the cabin's light. It was watching me, its gaze fixed and unblinking, its movements slow and deliberate. A fresh wave of terror flooded through me, cold and sharp. I knew, without a doubt, that it was hunting me. But the most terrifying part? I didn't know how. I didn't know what it was, or how it could be hunting me. Was it following me? Was it using the shadows? How long had it been out there? The figure took a step forward, and I heard the low growl again, this time from behind the shadows, closer now, unmistakable. It was a sound of hunger, a promise of violence. I gripped the rifle tighter, my knuckles white with the pressure, but I couldn't bring myself to raise it. I was frozen, unable to look away from those glowing eyes, paralyzed by the terror of the unknown. The growl faded into silence again, but the figure remained, slowly, deliberately moving toward me, a predator in its own right. And then, something shifted. The shadows began to retreat. The figure dissolved back into the dark, vanishing into the night as if it had never been there. I stood there, frozen, my breath ragged in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't think. What had just happened? Had it been real? Had I imagined it all? But the whispers were back. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices, clear and sharp, like they were speaking directly into my ears. I couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear. I was being hunted. And whatever it was out there, it wasn't going to stop until it caught me. The sun had barely risen when I made my decision. It wasn't a rational choice, there was nothing about it that made sense. But something had snapped inside me, a thin thread of fear that had frayed and broken in the darkness of that night. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer, feeling trapped, feeling haunted. I couldn't let the desert, whatever it was out there, hold me in its grip any longer. I had to face it. I had to confront whatever it was, whether it was real or just a manifestation of my own terror. Maybe if I saw it for what it really was, I could finally make sense of it. Maybe if I stood in the open, face to face with the thing lurking just beyond the shadows, I could wrestle some control back from the fear that gnawed at me. I grabbed my rifle, though I knew in my gut it was useless against whatever hunted me. A gun couldn't kill something that didn't follow the rules of nature. But it was something, at least. It was a connection to the reality I had once known, a shred of normalcy in a world that had slowly become surreal. I strapped on my boots, not bothering to eat or drink. I just had to go. I had to leave the cabin behind, leave behind the oppressive silence and the whispers, the growls, and the moving shadows. I couldn't wait any longer. The early morning desert was quiet. It was always quiet, but this felt different. The stillness in the air was suffocating, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The ground was cracked and dry beneath my boots, the familiar sagebrush and scattered cacti casting long shadows in the soft light of dawn. But today, it wasn't just the landscape that felt different, it was the air. It felt heavy, thick with anticipation. I could almost feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me, as if the desert was aware of my intentions, aware of what I was about to do. I moved forward, each step dragging more than the last, as though the earth itself didn't want me to go. The sun was climbing higher, but there was no heat yet, just the sharp chill of the morning that hadn't quite burned off. The shadows of the desert stretched long behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following, always just out of sight. I wasn't sure where I was going. I didn't have a plan, a destination. I just walked. The desert seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. No path to follow, no markers to guide me. I was walking blind, but at least it was a distraction from the gnawing fear inside me. I paused for a moment, standing in the middle of the open desert. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind stirring the dust. It felt like I was standing at the edge of something, a precipice between the world I knew and the unknown. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to listen, tried to sense if anything was out there. Nothing. Just the quiet. But I could feel it. I could feel the presence out there, beyond the stretch of land before me. The thing that had haunted me, the thing that had watched from the shadows, was still out there. I could almost hear its breath, slow and deliberate, like the pull of a predator's patience. I forced myself to move again, pushing forward despite the tightness in my chest. Each step felt heavier, as though the land was trying to keep me in place, but I had to keep going. I couldn't let the fear control me. The further I walked, the more oppressive the air became. The whispers, soft at first, began to stir again, carried by the wind. The growl had returned, faint but unmistakable, deep in the distance. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I pressed on, gripping the rifle tighter as if it might somehow shield me from whatever was out there. I tried to tell myself that I was in control, that I was the one making the decisions, the one who would face the fear head on. But the closer I got to the heart of the desert, the less certain I felt. The growl was louder now, closer. It echoed through the bones of the earth, reverberating in my chest, as though it was coming from beneath the ground itself. The shadows around me flickered, stretching unnaturally again, though the sun was still high. The movement was subtle at first, just a twitch in the corner of my eye, but it was unmistakable. They were watching me. They were following me. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare to look. I kept moving forward, faster now, my breathing shallow. There was no turning back. The shadows were closing in, and I had to know what they were. The desert stretched out before me, infinite and indifferent, but in the distance, I thought I saw something. A shape. A figure standing in the sand, just beyond the reach of my vision. It was too far to make out, but it was there. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a mirage. It was watching me. I quickened my pace, desperation creeping into my limbs, urging me to move faster, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, waiting. My heart was in my throat now. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure, couldn't tear myself away from it. Every part of me wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my cabin. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I had come this far. I had to face it. But as I took another step, the figure in the distance shifted. It moved, slowly at first, and then with more purpose, more speed. It was coming toward me. And it wasn't alone. More shapes began to materialize in the desert, moving out of the shadows, their forms twisted and unnatural, like monsters from the deepest corners of my mind. They were coming for me. And I realized then, with a cold spike of terror, that it wasn't just the desert that was hunting me. It was something else. Something much worse. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't hide. The chase had begun. The desert had always been a place of extremes, the heat scorching by day and the chill biting by night. But this was something different. It happened so suddenly, it took me by surprise. One moment, the sun was warm on my back, and the next, the temperature dropped, a sharp, unnatural coldness creeping across the air. I could feel it on my skin, a sudden prickling sensation like the very air had frozen in time. It wasn't the cool relief of evening, it was deeper, a bite to the wind that shouldn't have been there. I shivered involuntarily and pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. The chill seemed to settle on my bones, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the horizon, trying to make sense of it. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the soft crunch of my own boots on the sand masking the sounds around me. But no, it was clear. There were footsteps behind me, coming from just beyond the reach of my hearing. Slow at first, measured, then a little faster, a little closer, like something or someone was walking in my footsteps, mimicking my every move. I froze. The sound wasn't my own. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. This was deliberate. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching against the dry desert earth, drawing closer. My heart thudded in my chest, my breath growing shallow. I turned, the rifle clutched tight in my hands, and scanned the barren stretch of desert behind me. Nothing. Nothing but sand. Empty, vast emptiness. I squinted into the distance, looking for any sign of movement, but the desert was still. No shadows shifting, no figures lurking. Just the infinite, dusty expanse stretching out behind me, silent and unmoving. The footsteps, however, were still there. The faintest sound, just at the edge of my hearing, as though they were right behind me. I turned back around quickly, heart racing, but all I saw was more sand and sparse cacti, the occasional rocks scattered in the distance. I took a step forward, my mind screaming at me to stay calm, to focus. Maybe I was hearing things. The desert could mess with your senses, especially if you were out here long enough. The sun, the heat, the isolation, all of it could warp your perception. But the footsteps, those weren't a figment of my imagination. They were real. And they were getting closer. I could hear them now, the crunch of boots, or something else, something heavier, pressing into the dry earth just behind me. Too close for comfort, but still, there was nothing when I looked. Nothing but the endless stretch of desert and the feeling of eyes on me. I started walking again, quicker now, my heart pounding in my ears. My steps were faster, more erratic, but the sound of footsteps following mine didn't fade. They matched my pace exactly, like a shadow stalking me, always just a step behind. It was as if I had entered a trap, as though the desert itself had changed its nature, becoming alive, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I stopped once more, trying to steady my breath, trying to calm my mind. I had to confront this. I had to see what was causing this. But the coldness in the air seemed to grow, settling deeper around me, pressing against my chest. The footsteps stopped too. For a long, horrifying moment, there was nothing but silence. I glanced over my shoulder again, this time with more urgency, my eyes desperately scanning the barren desert behind me. Nothing. No figure. No shape. Just the sand and the distant, empty sky. The cold was worse now, colder than I had ever felt in the desert. The chill wasn't just in the air, it was in my bones, my muscles, creeping through me like a creeping frost. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to flee back to the cabin and never look back, but something in me told me to stay. To face whatever was out there. And then, as if in response to my thoughts, the sound came again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were beside me. I snapped my head to the side, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing. The desert stretched out as far as I could see, no sign of anything or anyone. The footsteps were gone again. But the sensation remained, the feeling of being hunted. It wasn't just the footsteps. It wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling of eyes, of something close, something invisible and relentless, moving in the shadows of my mind. I gripped the rifle tighter, my knuckles white with tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much I tried to prepare, nothing I had in my hands could stop what was out there. The desert wasn't empty. It wasn't silent. It wasn't still. It was alive with something else. Something that followed. And that something was waiting for me to make my next move. I turned and started walking faster, the sound of my footsteps blending with the phantom ones behind me, echoing in the emptiness. The desert shifts at night. There's a quiet magic to it, a feeling that's hard to describe, as if the land breathes differently under the cover of darkness. The heat fades, and the coolness settles like a blanket over everything, but it's not a soothing cool. It's sharp, unnerving. I had been walking for hours, my feet dragging through the sand, each step heavier than the last, each breath colder than the one before it. The sun had finally dipped beneath the horizon, and the stars were starting to emerge, a blanket of pinpricks in the vast black sky. The desert was a place of isolation, but the night made it even more so. I could feel the silence closing in on me, pressing from all sides. And then it started again, the shifting, the movement at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks, the deepening shadows creating shapes that weren't really there. But no, this was different. The shadows weren't just stretching, they were moving, slithering, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I paused, my breath catching in my throat, and looked around. The sand stretched out before me, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The sparse vegetation cast long, dark shapes across the desert floor, but these were different. The shadows weren't cast by any objects I could see. They were darker than the rest of the night, thicker, as if they were pulling themselves from the ground, from the air itself, as if they were alive. I took another step, but my foot faltered as the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just a vague sense anymore, it was palpable, like hands on my shoulders, like breath on my neck. The shadows were moving closer, swirling, darting just beyond the corner of my vision, and no matter how fast I turned, they were always just out of reach, always one step ahead. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling dry leaves. Then louder, more distinct, but still barely audible. They weren't words. No, they were like thoughts. Voices without bodies, murmuring unintelligibly, laced with a cold malice that sent a chill through my spine. The air around me seemed to vibrate with them, a soft hum that felt unnatural. It was as if the very desert itself had a voice, and it was speaking to me. I spun in a circle, rifle raised, but the darkness was too much. Too deep. I couldn't see anything beyond the light of the moon. I couldn't even be sure what was real anymore. The world around me was shifting, warping, like a mirage I could never quite touch. The shadows danced around me, weaving and stretching like liquid darkness, and I realized they were stalking me. Not just following, but hunting, waiting for the right moment. My breath was ragged now, each inhale a sharp gasp, and my heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't just a trick of the mind. This wasn't just the desert playing games with me. Something was out there. something that existed in the shadows, something that could manipulate the night itself. I stumbled back, my boots crunching on the sand, but no matter how fast I moved, the shadows seemed to keep pace. They were everywhere now, cloaking the ground beneath me, creeping up the sides of the distant rocks. The whispering was louder now, almost like a growl, a low, guttural sound that felt like it was coming from inside my head. The whispers weren't just voices anymore, they were commands, promises, the kind of words you didn't want to hear. I turned in a frantic circle, but each way I looked only confirmed the horror the shadows had taken on shape. The edges of the darkness were rippling, like something alive was crawling through the sand, moving in unnatural ways. The desert had stopped being a place. It had become a hunting ground. I couldn't run. There was nowhere to run to. The land stretched in every direction, endless and empty, and no matter how far I went, the shadows would follow. I could feel them closing in, tightening around me like a noose. They were alive, and I wasn't sure what would happen when they reached me. I raised the rifle, my hand shaking, trying to steady it, but my mind was in chaos. The shadows weren't animals. They weren't anything I could explain. And the desert wasn't just a place anymore, it was a living thing, its vastness an expanse of terror, stretching endlessly into the void. Suddenly, one of the shadows shifted more violently than the others, jerking forward toward me. My pulse spiked. It was like it had a will of its own, a single intent, to consume. And I was its prey. The temperature plummeted even further, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my very core. I could feel the presence of it now, not just around me, but inside me. The weight of the air was crushing, pressing on my chest as if the entire desert was closing in. Then, out of nowhere, there was a sound. A snap. A crack. Like the breaking of bones. And the shadows recoiled for a moment. For just a second, they pulled back, as if uncertain. But that uncertainty was only fleeting. It came back, faster than before. More aggressive. I could feel my grip on reality slipping. I didn't know what was real anymore, what was inside my head, and what was out there in the dark, waiting to swallow me whole. The line between the shadows and my mind had blurred completely. I couldn't separate them. It was all one. It was all haunting me. I turned and ran then, the rifle still clenched in my hands, but my legs felt like they were moving through water, heavy and slow. Every sound around me grew louder, the whispers deafening, the shadows racing behind me, consuming the world as I ran, faster and faster. And I realized then, deep down, in the pit of my stomach, that I wasn't just being hunted. I was being chased. I was running, but where was I going? The desert stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. There was no path, no trail, just the vast, empty expanse, and the dark, shifting shadows that seemed to chase me no matter how fast I moved. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning, but still, I ran. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper into the nightmare, further away from any hope of safety. The cold had seeped into my bones now, the chill cutting through my skin like a blade. I could feel it spreading inside me, a numbing force that made it harder to move, harder to think. The whispers were louder, and the shadows, they were closer, too close. I could almost feel them brushing against my skin, the air thick with their presence, like they were touching me. I tried to focus, to push the panic down, but it clawed at me, rising from the pit of my stomach, spreading through my chest, choking me. It wasn't just the fear of being followed anymore. It was the knowledge that I wasn't going to outrun them. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself, The desert was closing in on me. I could feel it in every step, in every breath I took. My vision blurred, my mind scrambled to make sense of the growing sense of dread. The ground beneath me shifted with each step, as if it were moving in time with the pounding of my heart. The shadows weren't just behind me anymore. They were everywhere. They were in the air, in the sand, in the wind itself. I could hear them now, no longer just whispers, but low growls, like something deep and ancient was stirring beneath the earth. The desert had always been a place of solitude, but now it felt alive, alive with something. Something that was not just watching, but hunting. And I was its prey. I stumbled, my foot catching on a rock hidden beneath the sand. I barely managed to catch myself, the rifle falling from my hands and skidding across the ground. I reached for it, but the shadows were closing in, their forms twisting and stretching like they were trying to engulf me. I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst. My body screamed for rest, for escape, but the desert offered nothing. It gave no mercy. I stood there, panting, my fingers trembling as they reached for the rifle, but the world around me had become a blur of darkness. The shadows weren't just chasing me anymore. They were part of me now. I could feel them inside my head, whispering thoughts that weren't mine. I could hear them crawling through my mind, sowing seeds of doubt, fear, despair. What's the point of running? You can't outrun it. It's already inside you. I shook my head, trying to fight the thoughts. But they were getting stronger, more persistent, feeding on my panic, on my terror. I could feel my mind splintering, unraveling. The shadows weren't just out there. They were in here, in my thoughts, twisting everything, turning my reality into a nightmare. I turned again, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the desert around me, but the landscape had become a labyrinth, the rocks and cacti shifting and warping like the very earth was trying to swallow me whole. There was no way out. I collapsed to my knees, my hands trembling as they dug into the sand, trying to anchor myself to something solid, something real. But the sand was loose, shifting beneath me like it was alive, pulling me deeper into the void. I could feel the coldness now, creeping up my spine, wrapping itself around my heart, squeezing it tighter with each breath. The whispering had grown louder. It wasn't just words anymore. It was laughter. Low, guttural, like something that had been waiting for me to break. And I was breaking. Slowly. Surely. I looked up at the sky, the stars now distant, cold, uncaring. The desert had swallowed the moon, and all I was left with was darkness. And the shadows. They weren't in the distance anymore. They were right beside me. Help me, the thought crossed my mind, but I didn't even know who I was pleading with anymore. There was no one to hear me. No one but the desert and the thing that was following me. I could feel it now, the presence, looming just behind me, its breath cold against my neck, its weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words wouldn't come. The fear had paralyzed me, turning my body into stone. They're going to catch me. The thought struck me like a lightning bolt, and with it, a surge of cold panic. The shadows were no longer separate from me. They were inside me now, wrapping around my mind, pulling it apart. I could hear their growling, their whispers, no longer whispers, but voices, mocking, taunting, promising something worse than death. They were feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing second. I tried to stand, to run again, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs felt like lead, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I could hear the footfalls behind me, closer now, heavier. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. I turned, eyes wide, searching desperately for some sign of life, some escape. But it was too late. The shadows surged forward, faster than anything should move. I could feel them closing around me, the edges of their darkness pressing against my skin, suffocating me, consuming me. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no escape. Not from the desert. Not from what hunted me. I had already been caught. I stumbled back to the cabin, my body moving on instinct alone, no longer in control. The desert had drained me, drained everything from me, until there was nothing left but exhaustion and terror. My steps were unsteady, my vision blurry, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The shadows were behind me, still stalking, still hunting. The whispers had grown louder, merging with the wind, creeping into my thoughts. I could feel them everywhere, touching my skin, tugging at my mind. They were close now, closer than ever. I reached the cabin, my fingers fumbling for the door handle, desperate to get inside, to hide, to be anywhere but here. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart thudding in my chest. The door creaked open with a groan, the familiar sound of my cabin welcoming me like a death sentence. I stepped inside, slamming the door behind me, my back pressed against it as if that could stop the dark things that were closing in. The room felt colder than it ever had before. The shadows weren't just outside anymore. They were already inside. I locked the door, but it felt like a feeble attempt. The cabin was just as empty as it had always been, yet the air was thick with a presence I couldn't ignore. The shadows, the dark things that had been chasing me, had followed me in. I could feel them circling, moving just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of the dim light from my lantern. They weren't just outside anymore. They had taken over everything. I couldn't think straight. My thoughts were a jumble of fear, adrenaline, and the relentless buzzing of the whispers in my mind. They had been chasing me for what felt like days, but it didn't matter how far I ran. No matter where I went, they would always be there, lurking in the dark, in the spaces I couldn't see. They were part of this place now. Part of me. I had nowhere to run. I turned to face the room, the empty, familiar room that used to bring me comfort. The wooden walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching longer and darker with each passing second. I could hear them now, moving, shifting, like they were alive, creeping along the edges of the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow, twisting and writhing like living things. They reached out, reaching for me, calling to me in a voice I couldn't escape. The air was thick, suffocating, and the whispers were everywhere now. You can't hide. The voice was soft, almost like a breeze, but it felt like it came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned, searching the room, but all I saw were the shadows, stretching, reaching, creeping in. The rifle was still on the floor, just within my reach. My hand twitched toward it, but I knew it wouldn't help. It wouldn't stop them. There was no stopping it. Not anymore. I stumbled backward, my legs too weak to hold me, but the shadows were closing in, circling around me like a trap. I could feel their presence, each shadow a part of something bigger, something ancient. Something that had been waiting for me, waiting for this. There was no escape. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The shadows seemed to be pulling at me, drawing me in, swallowing me whole. I pressed myself against the wall, my back flat against the rough wood, but it felt like it was no longer solid. Like it was part of the darkness now, part of the thing that had been hunting me. I could feel it all around me, closing in. "You're not alone." The voice was almost playful now, a mockery of everything I had once known, of everything I had believed. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The shadows surged forward, a wave of darkness that filled the room, blurring everything around me. The walls, the door, the windows, none of it existed anymore. There was only the blackness, stretching into eternity, and the whispers, oh, the whispers, telling me over and over that I was already lost. I reached for the door, the lock, anything, but the shadows were there, right in front of me, swallowing the light, smothering my hopes of escape. They were around me now, filling the cabin, and I realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't just shadows. They were alive. They were the thing I had been running from, the thing that had followed me, the thing that had always been there, in the dark corners of the desert. And now, they were inside the cabin with me, inside my mind. The room was gone now, replaced by an endless, suffocating darkness. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I could only feel the shadows closing in, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. There was no escape. The whispers were all I could hear now, a chorus of voices, all of them speaking at once, filling every inch of my mind. They had found me. They had caught me. And I realized, too late, that the desert hadn't just been a place. It had been the trap. The shadows weren't a force of nature. They were the desert itself. And the desert had claimed me. The desert had never been kind, but today it felt colder than usual, like it was hiding something. I stepped out of the cabin, feeling the weight of the shadows pressing down on me. The night had passed in a blur, restless, broken, the whispers still echoing in my head. But something had changed. Something was different now. I walked into the open desert, my boots crunching against the dry earth beneath me. The sun was still low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out further than they should. The air felt thinner, as though the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wasn't sure why I was out here, but the need to understand, to make sense of what had been happening to me, pulled me forward, deeper into the wild, empty expanse. I was hoping to find something, anything, to make it all feel less impossible. But as I crested a small hill, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, half buried in the sand, was a body. The dry, desiccated corpse of an animal, something I couldn't quite place at first. It was the size of a coyote, but its features were wrong. The body was skeletal, the fur matted and patchy, but what made my stomach turn was the unmistakable sign of violence, deep puncture wounds on its neck, and the skin around them stretched and torn. Blood was long gone, leaving only the memory of it behind in the drying, cracked flesh. I crouched down, my fingers hovering over the animal's body, afraid to touch it but compelled to look closer. The wounds were clean, almost surgical in their precision. The skin around them looked shriveled, as if whatever had drained the blood had done so slowly, methodically. There were no signs of a struggle, no claw marks or bite marks, just those deep punctures and the emptiness that had once been life. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced back to the whispers, to the shadowy figures, to the way the darkness seemed to follow me. What if I wasn't being hunted by a predator of flesh and bone? What if this thing wasn't a thing at all, but something more insidious? Something that didn't need to tear flesh or leave obvious marks, something that could drain life in a way I couldn't understand? My hands trembled as I reached for the body, pulling it from the sand to examine it more closely. There were no obvious clues as to what it had been, no fur or scales that might identify it, just the lifeless, drained corpse, its blood stolen away. The thought churned in my stomach, a growing suspicion that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The desert wasn't just home to coyotes and rattlesnakes. There was something else here, something older, something that didn't follow the rules of nature. The puncture wounds were too precise, too unnatural. No animal did this. The thought of a creature, no, something more, using shadows, feeding on blood, draining its victims dry in silence, made my skin crawl. I stood up slowly, backing away from the body. My heart was pounding, and a deep sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The air around me felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. I looked around, half expecting to see the shadows closing in, watching me, waiting. I was being hunted. I wasn't just imagining it. The thing that had been stalking me, the thing that had followed me from the depths of the desert, wasn't just an animal or a figment of my fear. It was something much worse. The body in front of me was evidence that the desert had a predator unlike anything I could have ever imagined. And I was its next victim. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no escaping this. The thing that had been following me had left me a warning, a sign. The question wasn't whether I could outrun it, but whether I could survive long enough to understand it. The truth was more terrifying than I could have ever guessed, and I was beginning to realize just how deep this darkness ran. The whispers had already begun again, filling the air with their chilling, mocking tones. You know what it is now, they seem to say, you know what's out there. And it's already inside you. I could hear the shadows closing in again, moving, shifting. I didn't know where it was, or how it moved, but I knew one thing for sure, whatever it was, it had marked me as its next prey. And it was getting closer every day. The desert had claimed its prize. I was its latest victim, but I didn't know if I would survive long enough to find out just what kind of nightmare I was truly facing. The sun had climbed higher, scorching the desert in waves of heat that shimmered across the endless horizon. But the burn in my skin was nothing compared to the fire burning in my mind. The body in front of me, lifeless, drained, kept replaying in my thoughts. The puncture wounds, the absence of blood, the unnatural stillness of it all. It wasn't just an animal attack. There was something deliberate, something intelligent in the way it had been drained. I was no longer sure what I was dealing with, but one thing was certain, it wasn't a simple predator. As I stood there, my hands still trembling from the shock, the whispers in the wind grew louder, more persistent. My mind felt like it was spiraling, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed, but there was something familiar about it. I couldn't place it at first, but a memory began to surface from the distant recesses of my childhood. When I was younger, my grandmother used to tell me stories about creatures that stalked the deserts. She was a superstitious woman, always looking over her shoulder, muttering about the things that hid in the dark. I thought it was just old folklore, the kind of tales to make children afraid of the night. But one creature always stood out in her warnings, El Chupacabra. She told me it was a bloodsucker, something that preyed on livestock, draining them of life, leaving behind only the desiccated husk of its victims. It was a creature of shadows, something that could slip through the cracks of reality, lurking just beyond sight. I remembered her voice trembling as she spoke of it, her eyes wide with fear. You hear the footsteps in the sand, Nino, she'd say. You feel the weight of the air change? It's coming for you. At the time, I had laughed it off, chalking it up to an old woman's exaggerated tales. The Chupacabra was just a story, a myth. But now, Now, standing in the middle of the desert, staring at the empty shell of an animal that had been drained of its blood, the pieces began to click together in a way that made my skin crawl. Could it be possible? Could this thing, this chupacabra, actually exist? I shook my head, trying to banish the thought. It was absurd. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to not fall into the trap of superstition. But then I remembered the whispers, the shadows moving just beyond my reach, the eerie presence that seemed to stalk me every night. Could it really be that something as old and monstrous as the chupacabra had been here all along, in this desolate wasteland, feeding in the shadows? The more I thought about it, the more the idea didn't seem so ridiculous. The desert was a vast, empty place, full of mysteries and secrets. What if there were things here, ancient things, that the world had forgotten or dismissed as fantasy? And what if, just like in the stories, one of those things had set its sights on me? I took a shaky breath, the air thick with the weight of realization. I had always believed those stories to be just that, stories. Fables to scare children and keep them from wandering too far into the night. But now, I wasn't so sure. The body, the marks, the whispers, it was all too much to ignore. I could feel a cold pit forming in my stomach, a knot of fear that had nothing to do with the heat of the desert or the weariness in my bones. I glanced around, as if expecting to see it standing in the distance, watching me with cold, unblinking eyes. But there was nothing. Just the empty expanse of the desert, stretching out in every direction, the wind carrying with it the faintest traces of something foul, something dead. Could the chupacabra have been here all along? Was it the thing that had been following me, that had been waiting for me to stumble into its grasp? I stepped back from the body, my legs unsteady, as the stories of my childhood returned with a vengeance. I remembered the tales of people who had disappeared, cattle and goats found drained of blood, the telltale puncture wounds on their necks. My grandmother had said that the chupacabra would take its time, that it didn't rush its feast. It was a patient hunter, one that struck when least expected. But when it did strike, it did so with terrifying precision. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell myself that it was just a wild animal, a coyote or something else, and that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the truth was clear. I was dealing with something far more dangerous than anything I had ever imagined. And I was its prey. As the sun hung heavy in the sky, I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. The shadows that had been creeping into my life weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real, and whatever was hiding in them was hunting me. It was the chupacabra, just like the stories said. And it was only a matter of time before it made its move. I had to face the truth now. Whatever I was up against, it was no longer a legend. It was alive, and it was getting closer. And if I didn't figure out how to stop it, I would become its next victim, just like the animal I had found in the sand. The desert sun was beginning to set, casting a long, orange glow over the land. The air had cooled, but my mind felt like it was on fire. The body, the puncture wounds, the whispers, and now the chilling realization that El Chupacabra, the very creature of childhood nightmares, might be real. Every step I took felt like a step deeper into something I couldn't control, something ancient and predatory. I couldn't just wait for it to come for me. I had to understand what I was dealing with. I needed more information. A sense of urgency gripped me. The longer I stood here, frozen by fear, the closer I felt to becoming another one of the creature's victims. I turned and hurried back to my cabin, my mind still racing, trying to connect the dots. I had a few things in my cabin that might help, old journals from my travels, books on desert creatures, and notes I'd taken from past encounters with wildlife. Maybe something, anything, could give me more insight into this monster that had haunted the corners of my mind. Inside, the cool darkness of the cabin wrapped around me, offering little comfort. I grabbed the old wooden chest where I kept my things, opening it carefully. Dust settled in the air as I pulled out a stack of journals, yellowed pages, old ink, scrawled with descriptions of strange places and odd creatures I had come across in my travels. I thumbed through them quickly, my heart pounding with a sense of urgency. I came across an old, worn notebook, the cover cracked with age. It was the journal of a man I had met years ago while traveling through the borderlands. A hunter, much older than me, who spoke cryptically about things he'd seen in the desert. His journal entries were sporadic, filled with stories of his hunts, but there were odd notations, things I hadn't thought much about at the time. As I flipped through the pages, one entry stood out, a faded, shaky scrawl that seemed out of place amid the rest. I read it aloud under my breath, as if trying to make the words more real. The Chupacabra. I have seen it. It stalks the night, feeding on the blood of the living. The tales are true. It does not kill outright. It drains slowly, methodically, leaving only the dry, brittle skin behind. I found the carcass of a dog near the riverbed, its skin hanging off like a rotting husk. The marks on its neck were unmistakable, 2 puncture wounds, perfectly round. And when I touched it, it was like the life had been sucked out of it. Nothing but a shell. I don't know if I can stop it. It's too fast, too smart. I know it's following me, but I can't escape. I fear it will take me next. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. It was exactly like what I had seen in the desert today. The same drained body, the same puncture marks, the same feeling that something was hunting me. The journal went on to describe the creature in more detail. It didn't have a clear shape, sometimes it was a shadow, a blur in the corner of the eye. It could move faster than anything natural, and its preferred method of attack was blood draining, leaving only the dry, leathery remains of its prey. Its presence was often heralded by the faint scent of decay, the unnatural stillness in the air, and the whispers carried by the wind. The hunter had written that the Chupacabra was patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and that it thrived on isolation. It fed on the lone and the vulnerable. I slammed the journal shut, the weight of the words sinking into my chest. I wasn't just being paranoid. I wasn't imagining it. Everything I had been experiencing, the shadows, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted, was leading me to the same horrifying conclusion. The Chupacabra was here, in the desert, stalking me. The journal spoke of fear, of a terror that grew with each passing night, a terror that twisted the mind until there was no escape. The creature didn't kill quickly. It drained its victims slowly, letting them suffer before it took their life completely. It didn't just take the blood, it took the soul, leaving only a hollow, dry shell behind. The reality of what I was dealing with was settling in now. This wasn't some animal, this wasn't a coyote or a mountain lion. This was something else, something ancient, something that had been living in the shadows for centuries, feeding on whatever came close enough to its domain. I was no longer just a man in the desert. I was a target. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fight it. The journal had made that clear. The creature moved too fast, too silently. It struck when least expected and left nothing behind but death. It had no weaknesses, no clear way to defend against it. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed inevitable that I, too, would end up as nothing more than a dried husk, just like the animal I had found earlier. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I couldn't just lay down and wait for it to come for me. There had to be something some way to fight back, some way to survive. I couldn't let it end like this. I grabbed another book from the shelf, one on desert mythology and creatures. There had to be something, some ancient knowledge, some forgotten method of survival against this monster. The more I flipped through the pages, the more desperate I became. And then, there was a mention of an old ritual, a possible way to ward off creatures like the chupacabra. The words blurred together as I read, the sense of hope and dread rising in my chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. If I was going to survive, I needed to act quickly. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I slammed the book shut and stood up, determination setting into my bones. Whatever this creature was, whatever nightmare had taken root in the desert, I wasn't going to let it take me without a fight. I had to prepare. The hunt was on. And this time, I was going to be the one doing the hunting. The nights had become unbearable. Each sunset marked the beginning of a long, sleepless vigil, my eyes never leaving the dark expanse of the desert that stretched out beyond my cabin. The shadows were closer now, so close, I could almost hear them breathing. They waited for me, patient and relentless, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I couldn't let that happen. Not without a fight. I spent my days preparing, collecting anything I could think of that might help me trap or ward off whatever was out there. I rigged crude traps around the cabin, simple snares, tripwires made from old rope and metal, and scattered food as bait. I had read about creatures like this, things that hunted in the dark, and knew that sometimes the only way to deal with them was to face them head on. But no matter how many traps I set, no matter how many nights I stayed awake, nothing happened. Night after night, I waited, breath held, fingers clutching a rifle that seemed more like a comfort than a weapon. The sounds of the desert seemed to taunt me, whispers on the wind, the occasional rattle of a distant creature, the howl of a coyote in the far-off hills, but the shadows themselves never materialized. They were there, I could feel them, but they stayed just out of reach. I began to question my sanity. Was I imagining it? Had the isolation finally taken its toll? Was I simply losing myself in the vast emptiness of this place, creating enemies where none existed? But then, I'd hear the soft scrape of something moving through the sand, and my skin would crawl. The shadows weren't figments of my imagination. They were real. I could feel them closing in. On the 5th night of my watch, I checked the traps again, nothing. No sign of disturbance. No evidence that anything had even been near. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though. There was a palpable tension in the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. I set out again, making my way through the sand with a flashlight in hand. The light flickered and cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch in impossible directions. Every step I took felt like it could be my last. But I pushed forward, determined to find some trace of the thing that had been stalking me. I knew I couldn't afford to wait any longer. The longer it waited, the stronger it would grow. And I had to act before it made its move. As I circled the traps, checking each one, the feeling of unease continued to grow. The darkness around me seemed to deepen, thickening like smoke, swirling in on itself. My breath came in quick bursts, and my grip on the flashlight tightened. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, moving in the shadows behind me. There was nothing. I walked back to my cabin, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had followed me all night. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a scent that was too familiar now. That foul, decaying smell. It was like something had died nearby, its corpse left to rot in the open. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows at the edge of my cabin were deeper tonight. They were no longer just fleeting movements at the corners of my eyes. They were thick, dark masses that seemed to twist and churn as though they were alive, watching, waiting. I stood still for a moment, just long enough to convince myself that I was imagining it. Then I heard it. A soft, low growl, barely a whisper on the wind, but unmistakable. It wasn't a coyote or a bobcat. It was something deeper, something guttural. My pulse quickened, and I reached for the rifle I kept beside the door. I forced myself to move, to check the traps one last time, even as the shadows closed in around me. I stepped carefully, listening to the desert's quiet pulse, the soft rustling of sand, the distant chirp of crickets. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, the growl lingered in my mind, wrapping around me like a coil of dread. I passed the first trap, then the second. But when I reached the third, right near the corner of my cabin, I froze. There was a mark on the ground, faint but unmistakable, 2 round puncture wounds, spaced just far enough apart to be consistent with the descriptions I had read in the journals. I dropped to my knees, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It's here. A cold dread seeped into my bones. The mark wasn't just a random pattern in the sand, it was a message. A signature. And it was as if the creature was mocking me, showing me that it had been close, so close, but I still couldn't catch it. I looked up, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. A dark shape, too quick for my mind to process, slipped through the shadows outside the cabin. It was large, its outline indistinct, but its presence was unmistakable. It was real. It was here. And it was getting closer. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. There was no more time to prepare. No more time to set traps or research. I was alone in the desert with whatever nightmare this thing was, and I had no choice but to face it. But as I moved toward the cabin, the growl came again, closer now. Louder. And I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't the hunter. I was the prey. And the shadows were closing in for the kill. The desert night had become suffocating. Every sound felt amplified, as if the wind itself was holding its breath. The growl from the darkness echoed in my ears, each vibration setting my nerves on fire. I could hear it now, moving just beyond the reach of the light, creeping closer with each passing second. The shadows were no longer just a sensation, they were something tangible, something that could be felt in the very marrow of my bones. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I wasn't alone. Whatever was out there, it was circling me, stalking me. It was hunting me. And the realization hit me like a thunderclap. I was the prey. The terror that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind had finally taken shape. I had been foolish to think I could escape it. This creature, this thing, wasn't just a shadow in the desert. It was something much worse, something ancient, something that had been here long before I ever stepped foot in this forsaken place. I tried to breathe, tried to steady my racing heart, but the air felt thick, suffocating. My mind was unraveling. Every corner of the cabin, every rustling in the sand, every gust of wind felt like a threat. The chupacabra, or whatever it was drawing nearer, its presence so overwhelming that I could taste the decay in the air. It wasn't just hunting me, it was toying with me, letting me feel its presence, letting me fear the inevitable. The shadows around the cabin were thickening, warping into shapes that I couldn't quite make out. I turned quickly, flashing the beam of my flashlight in every direction, but it was always just out of sight, always just beyond the edge of the light. But I knew it was there. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The fear wasn't just physical anymore. It was psychological. Every creak of the cabin, every crackle of sand beneath my boots was amplified in my ears. I had been out here too long, too alone. It was beginning to break me. I gripped the rifle tightly, my fingers numb against the cold steel. I knew it wasn't going to save me. Nothing was going to save me. This creature, this thing, had no weaknesses. It didn't care about guns or traps or anything else. It only cared about feeding. And I was its next meal. The growl came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right there, close enough that I could feel the vibrations in the ground. I turned to face the direction it came from, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A silhouette, shifting in the darkness, its form too twisted, too unnatural to fully comprehend. Its eyes, if they were eyes at all, glowed with an eerie light, reflecting the dim light of the cabin. It was large, much larger than I had imagined, its body obscured by the shifting shadows, like it was made of the very darkness itself. I stumbled backward, my heart thudding in my chest, a cry trapped in my throat. But it didn't come. My voice had abandoned me. It circled me, its shape merging with the night, and I could hear its breath, ragged and heavy, like a predator that had been chasing for days, weeks, maybe even longer. The whispers I had heard before returned, but they weren't carried by the wind anymore. They were in the ground beneath my feet, in the air around me. Whispers that sounded almost human, but not quite. The faint cries of those who had come before me. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs wouldn't move. Fear held me in place, rooting me to the spot like a terrified animal waiting for its end. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I knew that, no matter what I did, there was no escaping it. It was too fast, too silent, too smart. And now, with it so close, I could feel the weight of its hunger, the pull of its presence. It wasn't just hunting me, it was savoring the chase. The shadows closed in, the darkness pressing on me from all sides, the air thick with the scent of decay. I could feel it now, something moving just out of sight, its presence so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe. It was here. It was real. A single, sharp cry echoed through the desert, the unmistakable sound of the creature's growl. And for the first time, I understood its power. It wasn't just a creature that fed on blood. It fed on fear, on isolation, on the terror of knowing you're being hunted but unable to see the hunter. It wasn't just the chupacabra. It was something worse, something that had been born from the darkness of the desert itself. And now, it was coming for me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable, and in that moment, I realized something. The desert had never been empty. It had always been alive. Alive with things we couldn't see, things we couldn't understand. And I had come here, to this forsaken place, thinking I was safe, thinking I was in control. But I was wrong. I was nothing more than prey. And it was the end of the road. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than it had ever before. It was as if the very walls were closing in on me, squeezing out every ounce of breath until there was nothing left but the oppressive weight of the fear that had already taken root deep within my chest. But even in the midst of that overwhelming terror, something stirred inside me, something primal, something that demanded action. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding, hoping that somehow, miraculously, it would go away. The thing outside my cabin wasn't going to stop until it had me. And I wasn't going to just lie down and let it have me. I had to fight. I was no longer the man I had been when I first arrived in this desolate place. The desert had changed me, had broken down the parts of me that once thought I was invincible, self-sufficient, capable of surviving anything. But now, those same traits were my salvation. My mind was clear, focused on a single purpose. I was going to face this thing, whatever it was, and I was going to end it or die trying. I spent the next several hours preparing, gathering whatever weapons and tools I could find. The rifle, of course, was my first choice. It was the only weapon that could do any damage. I checked the ammunition, making sure the chamber was full and ready. But even as I did, I knew it might not be enough. The creature I was facing wasn't like anything I had ever encountered. It moved too fast, too silently. No matter how much I tried to prepare, I wasn't sure anything would be enough to stop it. Still, I couldn't just sit there, waiting to be devoured. I had to take control. I took the flashlight and rigged it with a crude set of wires, thinking that perhaps the bright light would at least disorient the creature long enough for me to take a shot. I set it up at the entrance, angling it to illuminate the area just outside. It wasn't much, but it was something. Every little bit counted. The sound of the wind outside was eerie, like it was calling to me, beckoning me into the dark. The growls, the whispers, the rustling of sand, everything seemed to conspire against me, pushing me toward the inevitable. But I had made my choice. I wasn't going to die quietly in the dark. I placed the rifle near the door where I could easily reach it and took a final look around. The cabin was still. Too still. It was as if the desert itself had fallen silent in anticipation, waiting for the showdown that was about to unfold. My breath came in shallow bursts as I crouched near the door, my hand resting on the rifle. The silence outside seemed to stretch into eternity. I kept my eyes fixed on the shadows that lingered just beyond the light's reach, hoping for any sign, any movement, anything that would give me a clue as to where the creature was. Then, I heard it. A rustling sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. Something was out there. It was close. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowly reached for the rifle, my fingers trembling slightly as I gripped it. I couldn't let the fear overtake me. I had to stay focused. The rustling grew louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch, twisting in unnatural shapes. The growl came next, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. It was close now. So close. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as the air grew thicker, more oppressive. The creature was here. It was waiting. I forced myself to take a deep breath, steadying my shaking hands as I slowly edged toward the door. I knew this was it. The moment I had been dreading since the first night I felt its presence, since the first flicker of shadow. I opened the door. And there it was. The creature stood just outside the threshold, its dark form blending into the night, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was larger than I had imagined, its shape shifting and flickering, like it wasn't quite bound by the laws of the physical world. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though it was sucking the life out of everything it touched. For a moment, neither of us moved. It seemed to study me, and I did the same. Its eyes glimmered with hunger, with something far more ancient and terrifying than any predator I had encountered. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, as if it was searching for the right moment to strike. I took a step back, forcing myself not to panic. I gripped the rifle tighter, prepared to fire. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. And then, without warning, it moved. It was faster than anything I had ever seen, a blur of shadow and motion. I fired, but the shot went wide. The creature was already gone, vanished into the night. I tried to follow its movement, but it was too quick. The only thing I could hear now was the thudding of my own heart in my chest, the ragged breaths escaping from my mouth. It was here. It was real. And it was toying with me. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. I didn't know how long I could keep facing it, hunting it in the dark, without losing my mind. But there was no turning back now. I had made my decision. And now, I had to see it through. The creature had come for me. But I would not go quietly. Not without a fight. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, stretching shadows across the desert. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, carrying with it an almost electric charge. It felt like the world was holding its breath, as if nature itself was aware of what was coming. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, as though the very land was preparing for the confrontation. Inside the cabin, I took a deep breath, steeling myself. The plan was simple. Wait. Wait for it to come. I had to confront whatever was hunting me, whatever had invaded my every waking moment. The shadows outside had been testing me, drawing closer each night, growing bolder as if they were pushing me, daring me to act. Tonight, I would make a stand. I checked the rifle again, ensuring it was loaded and ready. My hands were steady now, no longer trembling as they had been earlier. The initial fear was fading, replaced by something colder, more resolute. I was no longer terrified of what lurked in the darkness. I was angry. Angry that it had taken so much from me, angry that it had turned my life into this living nightmare. I walked to the window and peered outside. The desert stretched out before me, silent and vast, yet full of the promise of something worse. The shadows had shifted. They were no longer simply glimpses from the corner of my eye. Now they were shapes, clear, distinct, moving across the land in ways that no creature should. The darkness seemed to pulse, almost alive. And from that pulsing, I could feel its gaze on me. It was waiting. A growl echoed in the distance, distant but unmistakable. It was the creature, drawing nearer, making its presence known. My breath caught in my throat, but I refused to flinch. I couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. I knew it was testing me, waiting for me to make the first mistake, to let my fear get the best of me. But it wouldn't happen. Not tonight. I stepped back from the window, moving toward the door. The rifle was heavy in my hands, but I welcomed its weight. It was the only tool I had to fight back. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the front door. The sound of my footsteps was swallowed by the thick air, muffled as though the world itself was silencing me. The only noise I could hear was the relentless rustling of sand outside. A sense of foreboding washed over me as I stepped into the open. I felt the cold bite of the desert night against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill creeping up my spine. It was a stark contrast to the heat of the day, but I barely noticed it anymore. My entire focus was on the shadows, the creatures that had once seemed distant and intangible, but now they were everywhere. The night was alive with their movement. I turned my back on the cabin, trying not to let the familiar walls behind me comfort me. There was no safety inside now. There was only the hunt. Then, a whisper, almost like the wind itself, cut through the air. It was low, almost imperceptible, but I heard it. The shadows, once fleeting, now moved with purpose, drawing closer. I could feel their pull, like invisible hands reaching out for me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as a figure materialized just beyond the reach of my flashlight. For a long, terrible moment, I could do nothing but watch. The thing that had been stalking me for so long now stood before me, its form barely visible in the dark, flickering in and out of focus like it was made of shadows themselves. The air seemed to vibrate with its presence, each second stretching into eternity. I had never truly understood what I was facing until now. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't exist in the world, yet here it was, alive and hungry. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my knuckles turning white. Fear tried to claw its way back into my chest, but I slammed it down. No. This was it. This was the moment I had been preparing for. This was the only chance I had to survive. The creature's eyes flashed, glowing faintly in the darkness. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, assessing me. It was waiting for me to make the first move. But I wasn't going to give it that satisfaction. Without thinking, I took a step forward. My foot scraped against the sand, the sound like a sharp crack in the stillness. The creature's head snapped toward me, its form rippling like smoke in the wind. It was closer now, close enough for me to see the details. Its skin was slick and stretched, its body covered in the faintest glimmer of scales that caught the light from my flashlight. Its face, or what could be considered a face, was twisted, its features a nightmare of jagged lines and hollow eyes. My stomach churned, but I didn't back away. I held my ground. I raised the rifle. The creature hissed, a sound like air escaping from a balloon, low and guttural. It was a warning, I realized. A challenge. It didn't fear me. It didn't fear anything. But I would make it fear me. I took another step forward, the rifle aimed directly at the heart of the thing, knowing full well that it was my last chance. And then, as if it could sense my resolve, the creature lunged. The night erupted into chaos. The creature lunged at me with terrifying speed, its shadowy form shifting and twisting as it moved. For a moment, I thought it would engulf me entirely, swallow me whole. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. I fired. The shot echoed through the desert night, sharp and deafening in the silence, but it missed. The creature was already gone, its form a blur of darkness that darted just beyond the reach of the light. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, adrenaline flooding my system as I tried to make sense of the chaos. But then, I realized something. It wasn't just a creature. It was the darkness itself. As I swung the rifle back to scan the area, I could feel the change in the air, the very atmosphere thickening. The shadows weren't just moving, they were alive. They had weight, substance, as if they were extensions of the creature, twisting and coiling like serpents in the night. It was no longer just a predator lurking in the dark, it was manipulating the darkness around it, controlling it, weaving it into itself. The creature was the shadow, and the shadow was it. I stumbled back, feeling the cold grip of panic creeping into my chest. This wasn't something I could fight with a rifle. It was too fast, too elusive, and it wasn't bound by the same rules that governed the world around me. I could sense it now, almost more than I could see it, the way the air around me shifted, thickening, as if the very light was being sucked away, devoured by the darkness. A rustling sound came from behind me, but before I could react, the creature was on me. Its claws scraped across my skin, a searing pain that made me cry out, but it wasn't the physical wound that threatened to break me, it was the feeling of being consumed, of the darkness creeping inside, into my very soul. I could feel it trying to suffocate me, to pull me into the abyss with it. I raised the rifle again, but the creature was already gone, slipping into the shadows like smoke dissipating in the wind. The cold, oppressive air followed in its wake, and I could feel my mind beginning to unravel. It was toying with me. I tried to steady myself, but the darkness was closing in. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, like the earth itself was afraid of what was coming. The air was so thick now that it felt like I was wading through it, every breath a struggle. The flashlight flickered, casting odd, fleeting shapes on the ground, but they weren't enough to show me where it was, only enough to remind me that I was blind, helpless in the face of something far beyond my understanding. The shadows shifted again, but this time they didn't just move, they reached. I could see them now, long, gnarled fingers stretching out from the dark, creeping toward me like tendrils. They were forming around me, trapping me in a cage made of pure darkness. The light from my flashlight quivered, struggling to push back against the dark, but it was like trying to hold back an endless tide. I turned, firing again, hoping for some miracle. But the shot only echoed into nothingness. A deep growl vibrated through the ground, and this time it wasn't just the creature I could feel. It was the darkness itself, pressing in from all sides, trying to swallow me whole. I had never felt fear like this, not in the countless nights I had spent alone in the desert, not even when the shadows had first started to stalk me. This was something else entirely. It was primal, ancient, a fear that spoke to the deepest parts of my mind, parts that didn't understand survival but only understood being. The darkness moved closer, coiling like a serpent, and the creature was no longer just a shadow. It was everything. The growl grew louder, the sound reverberating through my bones, as if the creature was no longer bound by any natural laws. It had become the night itself, a living, breathing nightmare that moved through the air like liquid smoke. I could barely keep my grip on the rifle now. My hands were shaking, my vision blurry, as the world around me began to twist and bend in unnatural ways. It was coming for me. With a burst of desperation, I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay here. I had to break free from the crushing darkness that was closing in. My feet pounded against the sand, but it felt like I was running through quicksand, the ground pulling at me, dragging me back into the void. I could hear the whispers now, low and guttural, slithering in the wind. The creature wasn't just hunting me, it was inside my head, its voice creeping into my thoughts, twisting them, turning them against me. "Why run?" it whispered. "It's too late. You belong to the night now." The words stung, but I kept moving. I had to keep moving. I had to fight. I didn't know how long I ran, how far, but eventually I found myself back at the cabin. My chest heaved with exhaustion, my mind a fog of panic and confusion. The shadows seemed to follow me, stretching toward the cabin, coiling around the doorframe. The creature was still out there, just beyond the light, waiting for me to make a mistake. I slammed the door shut behind me, the darkness pressing up against the walls, trying to force its way in. I could feel it on the other side, the tendrils of shadow curling around the door, creeping beneath the cracks. It was getting closer. It was everywhere. But I refused to give up. Not now. Not while I still had breath in my body. I was going to fight. I was going to survive. The creature, the shadow, might control the dark, but it had no power over me. Not yet. The door rattled with a force that made the walls tremble, and I could feel the darkness pushing against every corner of the cabin. I backed into the farthest corner, away from the door, my mind a chaotic blur. The shadows outside grew longer, more twisted, and I could hear them scraping against the walls like claws, a sickening, rhythmic sound that made my stomach churn. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Every instinct screamed at me to fight back, to do something, anything, but there was nothing left to fight. The creature, the shadow, had already claimed this space. It had claimed everything. I grabbed for the rifle again, but my hands were slick with sweat. My fingers trembled uncontrollably, as if the very air around me had turned to liquid fear. The flashlight flickered weakly, casting sporadic beams of light that only made the shadows look more menacing, more alive. I pointed the rifle at the door, but my hands felt so numb, it was like I was holding a weight that wasn't mine. The growl that echoed through the night was so close now, it felt like the ground itself was vibrating with it. The sound was deep, almost ancient, a vibration that rattled my bones. I could feel it in my chest, the pressure of it, as though the creature was inside me, filling up the space in my body that was meant for air. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. The desert outside had gone eerily silent. No more wind, no more rustling. It was as if the entire world had held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The shadows at the door began to shift again, stretching and distorting, becoming something more than just darkness. They were tangible now, solid, moving like liquid, as if they were seeping through the cracks in the walls, pushing in on all sides. I backed away further, pressing my back into the cold wood of the cabin. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The weight of the creature's presence pressed against my chest, and I felt my heart beating harder and faster, as if trying to escape. The shadows were closing in. And then, a sound. A scrape, a whisper. I couldn't tell if it was in my head or real, but it didn't matter. The voice was familiar, the same voice that had whispered to me before, a voice like a growl, yet soft and slithering. You cannot hide. You cannot fight. You are mine now. It was real. It was here. I tried to move, tried to do anything, but I was paralyzed. Every muscle in my body was locked, frozen under the crushing weight of the dark. The shadow reached out, twisting and expanding like a living entity, wrapping around the cabin, around me. It felt like the air itself had turned cold and suffocating, as if the very light was being pulled away from me, dragged into the darkness. My body wouldn't respond. I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the suffocating blackness that consumed everything. It was like drowning in the night, suffocating beneath the weight of something that wasn't even real, but was real at the same time. The creature had no shape, no true form. It was everything. It was the dark that filled every crevice of my existence, the thing that had followed me since the first shadow flickered in my peripheral vision. And now, it was here. The light from the flashlight flickered once more and then went out, plunging me into absolute blackness. There was no light left, no hope left. I heard it then, the scrape of claws against the wooden floor, the soft whisper of the darkness as it reached for me. The air was thick, heavy with the sound of something approaching, and I knew in my bones that there was no escape, no way out. I could feel the shadow on the edge of my vision, creeping closer, consuming everything. This was the end. The desert had won. The creature had won. I was nothing more than prey now. A whisper in the dark. There is no escape. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable, but the shadows didn't strike yet. Instead, they lingered. I could feel them there, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides, waiting for something. Waiting for me to surrender. And in that moment, I realized the horrible truth. It wasn't just the creature that was hunting me. It was the darkness itself. The chupacabra might have been real, but it was a servant, a harbinger of something far older, far more dangerous. This wasn't just a creature stalking the desert, it was a force of nature, one that fed on fear, on isolation, on souls that were trapped in its wake. The darkness didn't need to devour me all at once. It was content to slowly unravel me, piece by piece. And I could feel myself giving in. I wasn't going to survive this. The last thing I heard was the whisper again, curling around me like a breath, soft and insidious. You belong to the night now. And then everything went silent. The silence was suffocating. My heart, still pounding, felt like a drum in my chest, a desperate reminder that I was alive. But the silence, this absolute stillness, was the kind that wraps around you, tightens its grip, and slowly squeezes the last breath from your lungs. I didn't understand what was happening. I couldn't. But in that moment, the fog in my mind began to clear. It wasn't just the creature I was dealing with. It wasn't just the chupacabra. That was only the surface of it. The real horror, the thing that had been creeping up on me, was something more insidious. Something that had been feeding off me the whole time. Fear. I'd felt it, deep down, from the moment I stepped into this desert. I had been alone for so long, but I had never truly been alone, had I? The shadows, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, they weren't just in my mind. They were real. They had always been real, feeding off the terror that grew with every passing night. The creature, the chupacabra, wasn't just a predator that hunted blood. It was a creature of fear, and it fed on that primal terror that takes root in your soul when you're alone in the dark, when there's nothing but the vast, empty expanse of the desert around you. It had been feeding off me. My fear had been its sustenance. My dread, my anxiety, my loneliness had been its nourishment. And every time I thought I saw the shadow out of the corner of my eye, every time I thought I heard footsteps in the sand, it wasn't just the creature, it was my own terror manifesting, growing stronger, more real. I had been feeding it. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. The realization wasn't a moment of clarity, it was an unraveling. It was the slow, agonizing peeling away of my sanity, layer by layer, as I understood the truth. I wasn't just being haunted. I had been haunted all along, by my own mind. The creature, the shadows, they were just a manifestation of my fear, growing stronger as I fed it with every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every whisper of panic. I looked around, my eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for something, anything. But all I saw were the same dark shapes that had been there all along, stretching like long fingers across the walls. The shadows seemed to breathe, to pulse, to live. This is it, I thought, feeling the last sliver of my sanity slip away. There's no escape now. There never was. The creature had been with me from the start, feeding on my terror as it grew. It didn't need to drain my blood, it needed my fear. It needed my mind to crack and splinter, and it had been feeding on that, like a parasite, growing stronger with every passing day. And it was almost finished. I could feel it now, deep inside me, the horror, the darkness closing in. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing against me, bending inward with every breath I took, suffocating me, making it harder to think, harder to focus. I felt like I was losing control of my own body. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for my rifle again, but even that felt foreign now, like it was a part of someone else's dream. The shadows, the creature, it was all blurring together, merging into one nightmare that I could never escape. I couldn't fight it anymore. I had become the prey, the sacrifice, the one who had allowed the darkness to grow strong by feeding it. My fear had been its meal, and now there was nothing left of me to resist. The last thing I remembered was the low, guttural growl that resonated in the depths of the cabin. It wasn't just a creature's voice. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the very bones of the desert, the voice of something ancient and hungry. And then the darkness closed in. There was no escape. There never had been. I had become part of it. The desert, the shadows, the fear, it was all one, and it was all consuming. I don't know how I made it through the night. I don't know how I survived. The terror that clung to me like a second skin, the way my heart hammered in my chest, all of it, the fear, the shadows, the unrelenting whispers, it never stopped. It was as if I had crossed some invisible line, and now the desert itself had turned against me. I woke to the first light of dawn, though it felt more like a taunt than a relief. The sun rose slowly, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sand. The desert looked just as it always had, vast, empty, and uninviting, but to me, it was a prison. I had never felt more trapped in my life. The wind that swept across the sand felt like 1,000 eyes watching me, judging me. It carried with it the scent of decay, that same foul, rotten stench I had noticed before, like death itself had decided to settle here, in this place. And yet, I couldn't escape it. The silence around me, the stillness of the desert, only seemed to amplify the gnawing sensation that something was wrong. I could feel the shadows lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, always there, always waiting. The sand beneath my feet seemed to whisper now, like it was alive, shifting with purpose, guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. I could hear the soft crunch beneath my boots as I moved, but the sound echoed unnaturally, amplified in the stillness of the desert. It was like the world itself was listening to me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I tried to go about my usual routine, to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The air was thick with paranoia, the weight of it pressing down on me. My hands shook, even as I tried to light the stove, to prepare something to eat. Every flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye made me freeze, every gust of wind sent me into a panic. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were closing in on me, watching my every move, growing more insistent with each passing moment. I could hear the whispers again, soft, insidious, like they were coming from within the walls of the cabin itself. They sounded like voices, but not human. Their words were indistinct, incomprehensible, like some language I could never understand. Yet I felt them, felt the way they tugged at my mind, digging into the cracks that had already begun to form. The creature's influence was still here, I realized. It was never gone. It was inside me now, crawling beneath my skin, feeding on the fragments of my sanity that were slipping away. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the desert, or the shadows, or the thing that hunted me. The place that had once been my refuge, my sanctuary from the world, had become my personal hell. The isolation that I had once cherished now felt suffocating. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was maddening. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, and every shadow seemed to have a life of its own, moving, shifting, waiting. The sun was high in the sky, but the heat felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I couldn't remember the last time I had slept, or eaten, or even cared about anything other than the overwhelming presence that hovered at the edge of my mind. I staggered outside, desperate for air, desperate for something to make sense. But even the vastness of the desert seemed to close in on me. The wind carried with it the whispers again, louder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, curling around the corners of my cabin, following me wherever I went. The creature was still there. I could feel it. It was always there, just beyond the edge of my sight, just out of reach. But it wasn't just the creature now. It was the desert itself, the very land beneath me, the sand that moved and whispered, that seemed to breathe with me. I stumbled towards the distant hills, my mind a blur, my thoughts scattered. I had to get away. I had to leave. But the desert offered no escape. Every direction was the same, endless, barren, suffocating. I could feel the weight of it on my shoulders, dragging me down, pulling me into the earth, as if the land itself was trying to swallow me whole. And then, just as I thought I might collapse under the crushing weight of it all, I saw it, a shadow, darker than the others, moving in the distance. I froze. I had seen shadows before, but this one felt different. It moved with purpose, with intent. It was no longer just the creeping darkness I had come to fear. It was something more. Something that was hunting me. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to escape. The shadow came closer, and the air around me thickened, like I was being smothered. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. You cannot escape. I could hear the voice again, the same voice that had haunted me for so long, but now it was not just a whisper. It was a command, a certainty, as if the very desert itself was speaking to me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the shadow loomed closer, darker, more oppressive. The creature, whatever it was here. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that I was its prey. I don't recognize myself anymore. The man I used to be, the one who could face the silence of the desert with calm and patience, feels like a distant memory, like a ghost that haunts the spaces between breaths. I can no longer tell if I am thinking clearly or if my mind has become just another part of the madness that has crept into this place. The shadows have taken root inside me, not just outside. They invade my thoughts now, slithering through my mind like some dark parasite, twisting and distorting everything I see, everything I hear. I can't remember the last time I felt truly awake. Was I ever? Or has this nightmare been unfolding for far longer than I ever realized? I move through my day, but it's like I'm no longer in control. My body moves on its own, following routines that no longer make sense. I try to do the simplest things, eat, drink, check the traps outside, and yet everything feels wrong. My hands tremble when I pick up the rifle, as though it's no longer a tool I trust, but a foreign object, something I don't even know how to hold. The sunlight seems too bright, too sharp, like it's trying to burn away the thin veil of reality that remains. But it's the shadows that are the worst. They move in ways they shouldn't, shifting my blink, stretching unnaturally across the ground, as if they're alive. It's as if they're aware of me, watching me, circling around me, waiting for something. Waiting for me to break. I find myself staring at the walls for hours, tracing the shapes of the shadows as they crawl across the wooden planks. Sometimes they look like faces, distorted, monstrous faces, leering at me with twisted grins. Other times, they're simply too vague to make sense of, just shapes that shouldn't exist. But they always move. Always. And when I look away, I'm sure they shift to new positions, growing darker, more defined. I can't trust my eyes anymore. I know that. I've seen things that shouldn't be there, things that vanish the moment I look directly at them. Figures in the corner of my vision, shapes that move with purpose but dissolve when I try to focus on them. Every time I turn around, there's something new, something off, just beyond the edge of my perception. And then, the voices. They come and go, like faint whispers on the wind. Soft, unrecognizable, like they're speaking from a great distance. But sometimes, when I'm standing perfectly still, I hear them right beside me, just in the corners of my mind. They speak in a language I can't understand, but I feel their meaning deep in my bones. The words themselves don't matter. It's the tone, the sound of it. It's mocking. It's patient. It's hungry. It's as if someone is pulling the strings, playing with me, watching me unravel from the inside out. And I can't escape it. The desert is too vast, too empty. I can run, but there's nowhere to hide. The shadows are everywhere now, seeping into my thoughts, clinging to the edges of my mind like parasites. Even in my sleep, I can't escape them. I dream of nothing but darkness, endless, suffocating darkness. I try to hold on to something, anything that feels real. But the harder I try, the more it slips away. The memories of my past life, the reasons I came here in the first place, they all feel like they belong to someone else, someone who isn't me anymore. The things I used to care about, the little comforts of the world, seem so distant now, so irrelevant. Nothing matters anymore except the shadows. They've taken over everything. I keep telling myself it's the isolation, the loneliness. It's just the desert, playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know better. The shadows aren't just in my mind. They're here. They are my mind. They've become a part of me, seeping into my thoughts, twisting them into something I no longer recognize. I try to talk to myself, to reason with the fragments of my sanity, but it's like I'm speaking to someone else. I'm not sure if I'm trying to convince myself, or if I'm simply trying to keep the last sliver of reality from crumbling away. Is this the desert doing this to me? Or is it something else? I can't be sure. What I do know is that the line between what's real and what's a hallucination is beginning to blur. I don't know how much longer I can keep holding on to the idea that there's something out there, something beyond the darkness. Because maybe, just maybe, the darkness is all there ever was. I can't take it anymore. I've had enough of this hellhole, this prison. The desert is closing in, and I'm suffocating in it. Every breath I take feels like it's filled with sand, every step I make feels heavier than the last. The shadows are no longer just a threat in the corners of my vision, they are the very air I breathe, pressing in from all sides. I need to leave. I have to. If I don't, I'll lose my mind completely. The idea of escaping has consumed me for days now, gnawing at me with a desperation I can't shake. There must be a way out, some road, some path that leads to civilization. I've been here too long, but if I can find my way back to anything real, maybe, just maybe, I can still save myself. I gather what little I can carry, water, a few supplies, and leave my cabin behind. I don't look back. I can't. I start walking, heading in the direction that seems most promising, the path I've walked 1,000 times before. But today, the desert feels different. It feels alive. The ground beneath my feet shifts unnaturally, like it's been altered by some unseen force, and the air is thick, heavy with a weight that makes my chest tighten. The wind stirs, but there's something off about it. The usual dryness of the desert air is replaced by a damp, oppressive heaviness. I keep moving, determined to put one foot in front of the other, but the farther I go, the less familiar everything seems. The landscape is shifting, bending in ways that don't make sense. The rocks look like they're closing in around me, and the distant hills I thought I knew so well have transformed into jagged, twisted shapes. I stop and look around, trying to orient myself, but there's nothing to ground me. The horizon is a blur, and the once familiar trail is gone. It's as if the desert itself has swallowed it whole, erasing all traces of the path I was following. Panic rises in my chest like a tidal wave, but I force myself to take a deep breath. I can't lose control. Not yet. I keep walking, but the desert feels different now. It feels wrong. I don't know how to explain it. It's as if the land itself has become a maze, pulling me in deeper with every step. The shadows are always there, always at the edge of my vision, shifting and moving in ways they shouldn't. I can't escape them. They're following me, just out of reach, like the predators they are, lurking in the darkness. The sun is setting, and I can feel the cold creeping in already. I know I need to find shelter, but I can't stop. The more I walk, the more the shadows seem to stretch, grow longer, more defined. There's no escape. I turn around, hoping to find some sign of civilization, but the landscape is completely unfamiliar. The shadows close in faster now, becoming darker, more defined, almost like they're made of something tangible. They're moving with purpose, and I feel the weight of them pressing down on me. I run. It's the only thing left to do. My legs carry me forward with all the strength I can muster, but it doesn't help. No matter how fast I run, the desert closes in around me, the shadows chasing me like a hunter after its prey. I think I can hear something behind me, the faint sound of footsteps in the sand, though when I glance back, I see nothing but the endless stretch of empty ground. My heart races, the pounding of it in my chest almost deafening. I can't breathe. I can't think. My only focus is on putting distance between myself and whatever is hunting me. But the desert refuses to let me go. Every path I take leads me in circles, back to the same twisted landscape, back to the shadows that have begun to swallow everything whole. I can't outrun them. I can't escape. The wind picks up, howling now, but it's not the desert wind. It's different, sharper, colder. A deep, guttural growl, like something alive and hungry, vibrates through the air. It chills me to the bone. My legs are shaking, and I feel the fear clawing in my throat, threatening to suffocate me. I turn and start running again, but there's no use. I know it now. The desert is alive, and it is drawing me in, not letting me leave. I can't fight it anymore. The shadows are closing in, and the realization hits me like a hammer. I'm not running from it. I'm running into it. The last thing I remember before everything goes dark is the sound of footsteps behind me, the growl that vibrates in my skull, and the sensation of someone reaching out to drag me back into the void. It hits me slowly at first, like a cold wind creeping through the cracks of a once warm house. But then, the truth settles over me, heavy and suffocating, and I feel it in the pit of my stomach. The impossible thought, the one I've been avoiding, the one that has been whispering at the edges of my mind all along, it's not a new terror. This has always been waiting for me. The desert. The shadows. The creature. It's all been a prelude. A slow, inevitable march towards something I can't escape. I stop running. The ground feels like it's shifting beneath my feet, and I suddenly have no desire to move anymore. My legs are frozen, trembling not from exertion, but from the weight of the realization that's pressing down on me, suffocating me. I stand in the heart of the desert, the wind howling around me like a living thing, and for the first time in what feels like forever, I truly understand, I'm not here by accident. This place, this nightmare, it's mine. It has always been mine. It has been pulling me, guiding me, leading me here from the very start. I think back to the years I've spent out here, isolated, alone. I came here willingly, thinking I was seeking peace, seeking some form of solace. The vastness of the desert felt like a refuge, a place where I could escape the noise of the world, bury my past, and rebuild myself. But now I see it for what it truly is, a trap. A prison. This desert wasn't an escape for me, it was a waiting room. A place for me to wait until the time was right. I was drawn to it, unknowingly, like a moth to the flame. All the strange feelings, the unease, the paranoia, the shadows that flickered just out of view were not just coincidences or tricks of the mind. They were part of the plan. My plan. My fate. Was this what I had been running from all along? The truth that this place, this cursed desert, had always been calling me? That I was meant to be here? I don't know. I don't know if it matters anymore. My mind spins, desperate to find something, anything, that will make sense of it. I think back to the stories I used to hear as a child. The legends of creatures that lurked in the shadows, waiting to feed, waiting to claim the souls of the lost. I thought they were just stories, just folklore to keep children inside after dark. But now I wonder if they weren't stories at all. Maybe they were warnings. Warnings about something that has always been here, something that waits in the dark corners of the world, feeding off the fears and the souls of the lonely. I remember the first night I noticed the shadows. How they danced just outside my cabin, teasing me, always out of reach. I remember the whispers, the soft voices carried on the wind. I thought it was all in my head, but what if it wasn't? What if those were never just whispers? What if they were calls, beckoning me deeper into the web that's been spun around me since the moment I arrived? The creature, the chupacabra, or whatever it is, hasn't been hunting me, hasn't been chasing me. No, it has been waiting. Watching me unravel, piece by piece, until I was ripe for the taking. I was never meant to escape. I was never meant to survive. I turn, slowly, as if I can feel the shadows gathering, closing in around me. My eyes dart from one side to the other, searching for something, anything that might give me some hope. But there is nothing. There is only darkness. The shadows are no longer distant figures in the periphery of my vision. They are here, all around me, pressing in, pushing me into the corner where I can't escape. I laugh softly, a hollow sound that doesn't even sound like my own voice. It's not relief. It's not fear. It's acceptance. I've been running from something I can't outrun. Something I was always meant to face. The desert has never been empty. It has always been full of things that are waiting for me. The past few weeks, the terror, the shadows, the whispers, they weren't random. They weren't just tricks of the mind. They were the end of a story that has been unfolding for much longer than I realized. The creature isn't just here because of me. It's here because it was always here, and I was always meant to walk into its grasp. The loneliness, the isolation, it was all a part of the plan, part of the waiting game. I can feel it now, close. The cold breath of something brushing against my neck, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if the creature is savoring every moment. I don't turn around. I don't need to. I know it's there. And somehow, in the depths of the desert, I realize the terrible truth. It has always been here. And I was the one who brought it to life. I am not me anymore. The man who arrived here, who sought solace in the silence of the desert, is gone. In his place stands a hollow version of himself, a shadow, just like the ones that have haunted me. I am not just a prisoner of this place, I am part of it now. The desert has seeped into my bones, the creature has seeped into my blood, and I am nothing more than the last echo of a life that never truly mattered. But there's a way out. I know it now. The answer has been with me all along, hidden behind the veil of my madness. If I can sever the connection between me and this place, if I can destroy myself, I will destroy it. I will end this nightmare. I stare at my hands, trembling but steady. I see the dry, cracked skin, the faint scratches from where I've clawed at the earth, desperate to find something real, something solid to hold on to. But there is nothing. Nothing except the endless expanse of sand and shadows that stretch out before me. I feel it then, like a weight pressing down on me. The realization that the creature, it is not something external. It is inside me, wrapped around my soul, feeding off my fear, my terror. The longer I stay here, the more I become it. It has already consumed my mind, twisted my thoughts until they are no longer my own. It's only a matter of time before it devours everything I am. There's only one way to sever the connection. Only one way to break free from this curse. I think of the old stories again, the ones from my childhood. The tales of sacrifices, of offerings made to the darkness in exchange for peace. They were always just stories. But now, as I stand here in the midst of my insanity, they seem so real, so clear. The creature is not just hunting me, it feeds on me. My fear, my desperation. And to stop it from feeding on my soul, I must give it what it wants. I must give it all of me. The wind howls in the distance, a lone moan that sounds like the creature's voice, calling to me, coaxing me, urging me to take the final step. But I know now, this is my choice. I am the one who decides. The shadows shift around me, stretching and twisting in the corners of my vision, becoming more distinct, more real. I don't look at them. I don't want to. I know that if I do, I will be lost forever. They are waiting, just like I was. But I will not be their prey. Not anymore. I gather the strength I have left, feeling the cold emptiness inside me, and I take the final step toward freedom. I know what I have to do. I make my choice. With trembling hands, I turn toward the edge of the desert. The horizon stretches out in front of me, a vast, endless expanse of nothingness. It's beautiful in its desolation. It calls to me, a place of no return, where I can finally sever the connection, where the shadows can no longer reach me. I step forward, feeling the sand beneath my feet. The wind stirs, and I know the creature is behind me. But I don't care. I don't need to look. I know it is there, waiting for me to make the final sacrifice. I can feel its presence, its breath on my skin, but it can't touch me anymore. I close my eyes and let the silence wash over me. This is my last moment of peace, the last breath I will ever take. I am ready. The desert is silent now, and I am no longer afraid. There is only the stillness. The shadows are gone, faded into nothingness. And then, just as I take the final step into the abyss, the world fades to black. In the end, it was never about survival. It was never about escaping the creature or the desert. It was about understanding the truth that I was never meant to escape. I was meant to end. The shadows were always mine to embrace, the desert always waiting for me. And now, in the cold, empty silence of the world, I can hear it, the final whisper. I am not alone. I have never been alone. The desert has always had room for one more. And now, I am the darkness. I am not sure when it started to slip, when I lost the line between reality and madness, when the desert began to consume me entirely. But I know now that it was always inevitable. The creature was never just a thing that lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike. It was always here, always inside me, a part of me. My thoughts scattered like windblown sand, each moment feeding into the next, each one more fragile than the last. I don't know if I'm still human anymore, if the man who once lived in this isolation ever really existed, or if he was just a version of me that the desert has slowly worn away. I try to focus, try to grasp the fragments of the world that remain, but they slip through my fingers like dust. The world is growing dim, quieter, like the life in it is slowly being drained. And I know now that it's the creature doing this. It's taking more than my sanity, it's draining my very essence. I feel it, like a weight on my chest, suffocating, pulling at me from the inside. I've stopped looking for answers. There are no answers left. I've searched too long, tried too many times to escape, only to find that every path leads back to the same place, this endless expanse of sand and shadows. The wind shifts, and I hear it again. That whisper, barely audible, but so distinct. It's coming. I don't turn to look. I know what it is. I know what's waiting for me. It's not just the creature anymore, it's everything, the desert itself, the night itself, the darkness that is wrapped around me, becoming part of me. There is no escape. I am trapped, and I always have been. For all the stories, all the legends I thought I understood, I was wrong. The creature doesn't just hunt. It doesn't just feed. It possesses. It becomes you, twisting your mind until you're no longer sure where it ends and you begin. And that's why I can't escape. I never will. The desert has always had a place for one more, and that place has always been meant for me. I stand still, trying to calm my racing heart, but I know it's futile. There is no escaping this now. The final reckoning is here. I hear the growl again, low and guttural, but this time it's not just outside, it's inside me, too, vibrating through my very bones. The shadows are close now, closer than they've ever been. I can feel them pressing against me, curling around me like a shroud. I don't know if I should be afraid anymore. The fear has faded, replaced by something darker, something that feels like acceptance. There is no fight left in me. I have become the thing I feared. And now it's time for the final step, the final transformation. The creature has won. It doesn't need to hunt me anymore. I am its shadow now, and I will walk with it forever. I close my eyes, waiting for the moment to come, knowing that once it does, everything will be gone. The world, the memories, the fear, all of it will disappear. And then, nothing. In the distance, a lone figure stands in the desert, looking out at the horizon. The shadows are growing longer, but there is no more fear. Only silence. And in that silence, a faint whisper is heard. It has begun. The desert waits. Always. Time has become a blur, stretching into infinity, a never-ending cycle. I wake, and it feels like I've never slept. I rise from my bed, if you can even call it that anymore, and the same oppressive weight fills the air. The same dry, relentless heat of the desert. The same suffocating silence that gnaws at my thoughts. But beneath it all, there's something new, something darker. I can't shake the feeling that I'm moving through the same moments, over and over again. Every day feels like the last. Each one is a mirror of the one before it, the one before that. The shadows never change. They never move away. They're here, always, just out of sight, just waiting. I find myself standing at the door again, looking out at the empty stretch of desert. The sun is setting, casting long, stretching shadows across the sand, and I know that it's only a matter of time before the night falls. I can feel it, deep in my bones. The darkness is coming, and with it, the creature that haunts me. I can't escape it. I can't escape the desert. I can't escape myself. I turn and walk away, back into the cabin. The walls are closing in again, but it doesn't matter. The room is just a physical manifestation of my mind. There's no point in hiding anymore. The shadows have taken every inch of me, every thought, every breath. There's nowhere left to run. I sit down, my legs weak beneath me. I don't know how long I've been here, how long I've been stuck in this nightmare. The days blend together until I can't remember what was real, what was just the creature's tricks. Each moment feels like it's been recycled 1,000 times, always the same, always the same. I hear the growl again. It's closer now. It's not just in the wind anymore. It's inside my head, inside my heart. It's like a whisper that never leaves, a sound that curls into the deepest parts of my soul. It has won. It's not just a predator anymore. It's part of me. It's made itself comfortable here, in my mind, in my body, in my skin. The shadows seem to stretch longer now, more alive than before. I swear they move on their own, shifting in my peripheral vision, just beyond my reach. But every time I look, they retreat, like they're playing a game with me. I don't have the energy to fight anymore. The fear has drained me, hollowed me out, leaving nothing but this numb, gnawing ache in my chest. It's as though I've been stuck in the same moment for an eternity, unable to break free. Every action I take, every decision, feels like it's already been made. Like I'm moving on autopilot, unable to steer myself away from this inevitable fate. I'm trapped in this cycle. Trapped in this loop of horror. It's as if the creature has turned me into its own personal plaything, an endless game of cat and mouse. But it's not a game anymore. I know it's coming. I can feel it breathing down my neck, just behind me. The walls seem to close in tighter, but I'm too weak to escape. The creature is always there now. It's no longer a thing lurking in the shadows, it is the shadows. I've become a part of it. I get up, my body moving without thought, without purpose. I move through the cabin like a ghost, unsure of what I'm doing, where I'm going. I know the desert is waiting outside, the same desert I thought I could escape. But now, it's not even a place anymore. It's a state of mind, a prison that has consumed every part of me. I step outside, but nothing feels real anymore. The desert stretches out in front of me, an endless expanse of emptiness. There's nothing here but the shadows, and they are waiting, patiently, silently. Every step I take feels heavy, like I'm dragging something behind me, like the weight of my own soul is pressing me down. There is no escape. There never was. I turn around and see the shadow again, larger this time, stretching toward me, growing darker, more tangible. It is there, just like it always has been. It has followed me, it has become me. And no matter how many times I turn around, no matter how many times I run, it will always be there, waiting to claim me. It's not just hunting me. It's consuming me. Piece by piece. It has already won. There's no way out of this loop. There's no way out of this madness. The desert has already swallowed me whole. The creature is no longer just a shadow, no longer just a figment of my imagination. It is the last thing I will ever know. And so I wait. I wait for the shadows to take me completely. The end is here. The desert is silent. The air is thick with the smell of decay, of something long dead, forgotten by time. I stand at the edge of my cabin, watching the shadows stretch across the sand like dark fingers creeping toward me. But I'm not afraid. Not anymore. The fear, the anxiety, the panic, it's all gone. Something inside me has snapped, and with it, the last of my hesitation. I've tried to outrun it. I've tried to hide, to reason, to fight. But every attempt has been futile. The creature is always there, always waiting. I've been running from shadows for too long. Tonight, I will stop. I will face it. I will end this, one way or another. I step into the night, my boots crunching on the sand beneath me. The air is colder now, the wind picking up as the sky darkens. The moon is a pale sickle in the sky, casting just enough light to see the twisted shapes of the desert around me. But I don't need the light. I know the darkness now, better than I know myself. I don't carry weapons. What good would they do? The creature is no beast to be killed with a bullet or a blade. It's not even flesh and bone. It's something darker, something ancient, something born from the very fabric of fear. I can feel it watching me, waiting. The shadows are alive, swirling around my feet, pulling at me, beckoning me closer. But I won't let them. This time, I will not run. I walk deeper into the desert, my heart beating steadily now, my resolve hardening with each step. The growl is faint at first, a low rumble on the wind. But it gets louder, closer, until it reverberates in my chest, a sound so deep it shakes me to my core. I know it's coming for me. I know it's here, just out of sight, circling like a predator. But I don't stop. I'm not afraid of it anymore. The ground beneath me seems to tremble, and then I hear it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the sand. It's right behind me now. I can feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against my back, its breath on my neck. But I keep walking. Come on, I whisper to the darkness, my voice low, steady. I'm right here. The creature doesn't need to hide anymore. I can feel its shape now, the dark tendrils of it swirling around me, stretching toward my feet, but I don't move. It brushes against my skin, its presence suffocating, and for the first time, I don't flinch. I don't recoil. I stand my ground. The shadow shifts, the air thickening with the presence of something monstrous. I can hear the creature now, see it in the periphery of my vision, its outline, flickering, like smoke. But I don't look directly at it. I don't need to. I know it's there. It circles me, but I am the one in control now. I'm not afraid of you, I say, my voice rising, the words breaking free of the tight grip fear has had on me for so long. You've been feeding on my terror for too long. It ends now. You are my terror, and I'll burn you out. The shadows begin to thicken, twisting, curling around me like tendrils of darkness. The growl grows louder, more insistent. But I stand firm, my breath steady, my pulse calm. I close my eyes, letting the darkness wrap around me. I reach for it, pull it in. It's inside me, always has been. I know now that this creature, this shadow, this parasite, it feeds on more than fear. It feeds on the soul. It feeds on the desire to escape, to hide. And I'm done running. In that moment, I embrace the darkness. I let it consume me, let it fill every corner of my mind, my body, my spirit. I don't try to push it away anymore. I don't fight it. I let it come. Let it take everything. Because I've already given it everything I have. I open my eyes, and the creature is there everywhere, swirling around me, 1,000 shifting shadows, 1,000 forms all at once. It doesn't matter. I don't fear it anymore. For the first time, I understand it. In a final act of defiance, I scream. A primal, guttural sound that rips from my throat. It's a scream of surrender, of release. I let go. And the darkness, my darkness, answers. It consumes me, pulls me under, and for the briefest of moments, I feel it, everything, the weight, the pressure, the endless hunger. And then, nothing. The desert is quiet once again. The wind is still. The moon hangs in the sky, untouched by time. And I am gone. There is no one left to hunt. No one left to feed. Just shadows. The air around me feels thick, like the weight of the world is pressing down on me. The shadows are no longer just shadows. They've become alive, swirling and writhing in the dim light of the moon. The growl I hear is not from a throat, it's something deeper, something that resonates in the very fabric of the night itself. It doesn't feel like the sound of an animal anymore. It feels like the sound of something old, ancient, and hungry beyond comprehension. It steps into view, but not in the way I imagined. The creature is not a simple beast, not the grotesque, hairless dog I once feared. No, this is something far worse. Its form seems to distort and flicker, like it can barely hold a shape. It's a mass of darkness that pulses with malice, a twisting amalgamation of shadows that slithers and bends like liquid smoke. But within it, within the depths of that darkness, there are eyes. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, glowing like red-hot embers, each one burning with an insatiable hunger. It's looking at me, not with eyes that can see, but with a gaze that pierces deeper than any flesh, deeper than any soul. This is not just a creature of blood and flesh. This is something that feeds on essence, on life. It doesn't just want my blood, it wants everything that makes me who I am. I feel it, the drain, the pull, as though the very air around me is alive with its hunger. It doesn't need to bite me. It doesn't need to tear me apart. No, it's already inside me, pulling at the strings of my soul, unraveling everything I've ever been. I can feel it siphoning away my memories, my thoughts, my very being. The more I stand there, the more I realize this thing is not a predator. It's a parasite. It feeds not on my blood, but on my essence. The ground beneath my feet seems to dissolve, as if the very earth is being consumed by the creature's presence. The sky above turns blacker than night, darker than any storm, as though the creature is swallowing everything around me, sucking the very light from the world. I want to scream. I want to run. But I can't. I'm frozen, not just in fear, but in the grip of something far worse. It's not just terror. It's despair. A complete, soul-crushing realization that I am no longer in control. That nothing in this world is real anymore. The desert, the cabin, the shadows, all of it is part of the creature's game. It has been pulling the strings all along. And now, it's here to take me. I try to move. I try to break free of its grip, but the darkness has already filled my lungs, my veins, my mind. It's inside me, taking me apart, piece by piece. I can feel my skin tightening, my heart slowing, my thoughts scattering like dust in the wind. I'm fading, dissolving, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. The creature steps closer, its form writhing like a living nightmare. I hear its whispers, low, guttural sounds that don't belong to any living creature. They are voices, too many to count, murmuring, calling, drawing me closer. The whispers wrap around my thoughts like chains, tightening, pulling me in. You thought you could escape, the voice says, a chorus of 1,000 different tones blending into one, all of them filled with hunger. You thought you were alone, that you could outrun me. But I have always been with you. You were never alone. The words echo in my mind, chilling my very soul. Always been with me? What does that mean? It doesn't matter. Nothing matters anymore. It's here now, its form completely materialized, a dark mass of shifting limbs and glowing, predatory eyes. It moves toward me with a grace that is unnatural, its form bending and warping as if the very laws of physics cannot contain it. I can feel its breath on my face, if it even has breath, and I realize with sudden clarity that this is no creature. This is an ancient thing, a force that existed before time. It is hunger incarnate, the devourer of light, of life, of essence. And now, it's taken me. My body goes numb. My mind begins to fracture. It's too late to fight back. There's no escape. The shadows have already consumed me. The last thing I hear is the creature's voice, now calm, now satisfied. You were always mine. And then, nothing. The world slips away in jagged fragments. My body no longer responds. The shadows have claimed me, devoured what little was left of who I was. The desert, once vast and lonely, now feels suffocating, like it too is closing in on me. The last remnants of my consciousness flicker, weak, struggling to hold on to the fleeting memories of a life I can no longer recognize. I try to scream, but no sound escapes my lips. There's nothing left but the darkness. The shadows envelop me entirely, crawling under my skin, inside my bones, twisting through the very fabric of my being. The pain fades, replaced by an empty void, a sensation that I am both everywhere and nowhere at once. I feel myself stretch, bend, break in ways that I can't comprehend. The darkness isn't just around me, it is inside me, eating away at everything I ever was, until nothing is left but the hollow shell of my existence. I hear the whispers again, now clearer than ever. They're not in my ears, but inside my mind, gnawing away at the last remnants of my thoughts. Each voice is distorted, filled with hunger, with anticipation. And I know, without a doubt, that this has happened before. It will happen again. The desert will always be here, waiting. The creature will always be here, searching for new prey, feeding on the fear, the essence of those who dare to enter its domain. It is endless, an eternal hunt, where the boundaries between the hunter and the hunted blur into nothingness. In my final moments, I realized the truth. I was never meant to escape. This was never a fight I could win. The creature wasn't just after my blood. It was after my soul, my mind, my very essence. And now, it has consumed all of it. The desert is silent once again, still as it always was. And yet, somewhere in the distance, something stirs. A shadow in the sand. A flicker in the wind. The hunt continues. The creature moves on, searching, always searching. The cycle is endless. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.